Okay. Are we recording, Cameron?
We're good.
Okay, good morning. Today is April 26, 2021. It's 8:36 a.m. and this is the regular meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. And my name is Suzanne Young and I am chair of the council. We have a pretty packed agenda today, so welcome everybody. And I think it's going to be a good and robust meeting, and look forward to getting started on it. We'll review and approve the minutes, hopefully approve the minutes of March 22. We'll talk about the draft outline of the climate action plan that we're working on. The chairs of the Just Transition, co-chairs of the Just Transitions Committee will talk about their work around public and stakeholder engagement. We'll have a public comment after that on that topic and the ones that preceded it. And then after a break, we'll get an update from Secretary Moore about legislative testimony a couple of weeks ago. The Vermont the Governor's American Recovery Plan Act proposal. We'll brief you on that and what's in there with respect to climate change. And then a little bit about the role and the function of the council in the coming months as subcommittees really start to power through their tasks at hand with some public comment and next steps. So with that, I guess I'd open it up to whether anybody has any changes, additions, or other comments on the agenda. Okay, hearing none, I guess we'll move on to approval of the minutes, David.
Yeah, so my name is David Plum. Welcome everybody. For those who haven't met me before, before we jump to the minutes, I do want to recognize we have a new council member with us today. And I thought it would be great to introduce her. Secretary Young, did you want to say anything about Iris as we get going here?
Yes, I'm sorry, Iris. That's my mistake. I didn't see your name on the screen and I'm not sure is she here with us?
Yep, right here.
Huh. Oh, there you are. Hi, Iris. Welcome aboard. And thank you for your interest in being on the council and for taking the time to join us. Iris has taken the seat that was Sophia Clark's, the youth member. And Iris, do you want to introduce yourself to the group and say hello?
Hi. As she said, I'm Iris Chung, and I'm a student at Essex High School and the youth member on the Climate Council. So looking forward to working with all of you.
And where are you from, Iris? In
Essex, Vermont.
Great. All right, well, welcome aboard. And I think you'll find this work very meaningful, and we really look forward to working with you. So thank you for reminding me about that, David. And
excellent. Yeah, wonderful. And Iris has been hard at work in the Just Transition subcommittee and is also working on another, I believe it's Ag and Ecosystems, Iris. So thank you for already jumping in with all that work to date. Okay, great. So let's do our usual approval of the minutes. Maybe Cameron, if you could throw in the chat. All these documents are hyperlinked to the agenda that I threw in the chat as well. We have the minutes from our last meeting. If anybody has any concerns about them, now's the time to bring up those concerns, or else we'll consider them to be approved. So any concerns about those minutes? I'll give you a second to click on them if you want to look at them one more time. Thank you, Cameron, for putting them in the chat. Okay. Last chance, any concerns? Great. So let's consider them approved. I'll just note that Commissioner Turney, you unmuted your mic. Did you want to jump in and say something about the minutes? No? Okay, great.
No, I thought we were going to do a voice approval, so my bad.
Oh, no, sorry. I'm creating new habits here. We'll see if they stick. All right, hearing no objections, let's consider these to be approved by you all. That's wonderful. So the first thing we're going to do today is we're talking about this as the the December 1st goal. And the way we're going to talk about our December 1st goal is by sharing a draft outline that, again, is hyperlinked to the agenda. And this is an important conversation because it's wrapping our heads around what is it we're actually needing to produce from a statutory standpoint, and what is it we can actually produce on December 1st. And this is a conversation we want to spend a little time this morning on. And Jane is going to walk us through this draft outline, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it and what it means for all of us in the work of the subcommittees and the work of the council. So, Jane, why don't you walk us through? Would you like me to share my screen with the document?
Yes, that's great. Or I can too, David, whichever you prefer.
I'm happy to do it. It takes one less thing for you to wrestle with.
Let me just give a little bit of background about the work to date that has gotten us to this point. There's been an undercurrent, of course, to understand the end game goal for all the subcommittees so that work planning can occur and the breadth and scope of the work that's happening within the subcommittees can plan accordingly. Along that line, I see one of my roles for all of you is stepping up to provide and sort out templates for you all to feed your work into through the subcommittees and ultimately through the review and approval of the council to consider for the climate action plan. In order to do that, it felt clear from all of you, as well as conversations down at the subcommittee level with broader subcommittee members, that seeing something as simple as a draft outline and coming to consensus around what that outline looks like would be important as a first step. So at the steering committee meeting two meetings ago, David and I worked together to provide the first cut of an outline for the steering committee to consider. Since then, we incorporated feedback from the steering committee members and put forward a second draft at the meeting last week. One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is how to represent recommendations and first and foremost strategies that get us to the 2025 statutory requirements, as well as set us up to get toward, a head start to get us towards the 2030 statutory requirements, recognizing that first and foremost, this will likely be the only climate action plan ahead of the 2025 statutory requirement, recognizing that we are required to reproduce a climate action plan every 4 years, but notwithstanding could choose to do an iteration in between those 4 years. So perhaps that's something to consider as we walk through the draft, what the goal is for this plan and how often we recreate it. I'll also say that if we are sticking with the every 4 year requirement, then we're also only looking at two plans, this first plan and then one more plan before the 2030 requirement. So we really need to be thinking not only about 2025, but really how we're going to get to 2030. I will suggest that the statutory requirement is quite clear around what we need to do for this first plan for the greenhouse gas emission reductions. But then we have a little bit more open-ended conversation to consider around what we do and don't want to include for the sequestration goals and the resiliency goals within the plan. And I will say, as we look through the outline, that since the outline went to the steering committee for their approval to come forward to this meeting, I have had a chance to meet with both the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee and the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee to consider further how I presented it within the current outline that you've all received. So as we walk through that, I can share and suggest some of the edits to improve those portions of the plan and let you know what those subcommittees are thinking. So David, do you want to tee up the outline? Thank you. So I'm going to walk you all through this quickly and then hope that with David's support that we'll guide you with some questions to think about, and hopefully we can have a great conversation about what you see as sort of right within the outline as presented and what you think should be restructured, and really get us to think about what we can and can't do by December 1st for this first plan. So some of the important sort of nuances at the beginning, headings are set us up. They're very similar to how other states have teed up their climate action plan, with opening letters from both the governor, the chair of the Climate Council, as well as a letter written in concerted effort and collaboration between the co-chairs of the other subcommittees, speaking to the goals and big vision for the climate action plan itself. I've left some space to think specifically broadly about the need for this around the effects of climate change in Vermont, as well as teeing up the requirements that are clear within the statute around the 2025, 30, and 50 requirements for greenhouse gas emissions. Before we get into any of the strategies and recommendations, as we are hoping and we'll learn from Just Transitions today, we'll then lead with the guiding principles that will come out of the Just Transitions Committee and be informed by the other subcommittees as well, setting us up to sort of ground us in what we're thinking about and how we want to meet the goals of the plan. The next sort of meat of the plan really gets at three main broad categories. It gets at the mitigation requirements, and again, the goals, the requirements, I should say, for 2025, 30, and 50. And then further down, which we'll get to, we've teed it up as sequestration and then resiliency, recognizing that the interplay between both ag and ecosystems and rural resilience and adaptation will sort of commingle those two sections. So very broadly, I'll just say that I've bucketed the work for mitigation similarly to how, or exactly I should say, is how cross-sector mitigation has put forward their task leads for the work to come out of that group. So there's transportation, there's buildings, there's non-energy emissions, and I'm forgetting if there's one other, electricity, thank you. And so, and then hearing from folks that agriculture will have a large focus, we've really talked about highlighting agriculture under the non-energy emissions, recognizing that it's the largest of the non-energy emissions. Before I get to the bottom there, David, can you scroll back up? So this will be repeated many times within each bucket of work, but this is really the meat of sort of thinking for all of you around how we're going to sort of deal with the 2025 requirement versus 30 and then further out. The way that we've thought about the language here is we've thought about strategies for immediate implementation, and the work then within that, those recommendations and strategies beneath there need to at the very least add up to the 2025 requirement, and as I suggested, get us on the way to the 2030 requirement. We're thinking about, there'll be multiple strategies there underneath for immediate implementation, and then there'll be multiple recommendations within each strategy, likely, for each of those. And then we're thinking about some, basic structure within that, thinking about a description and action type, and then an assessment of action. And this is one that we might want to talk a little bit further about. There'll be an equity assessment that'll come out of Just Transitions, and we're thinking about speaking to that and how these recommendations fit through that within each recommendation. So that'll come here, and then likely have some sort of sum total at the end of the plan. So, and then thinking about the economic assessment. And this was, we were really conscious with recommendations from the steering committee about using the term assessment rather than impact, recognizing that there'll be economic successes that come out of these recommendations, and hopefully that'll be the greater good, but there'll also be impacts, and we'll want to speak to that here. And then of course, for the mitigation requirements, and then for all of them, we need to be thinking about cost and funding considerations. And I imagine for the immediate implementation, this will have to get quite specific, as you know, because the sort of difference between us and some other states is really that we're required to get at the how. How are we going to implement these recommendations, and how are we going to hit the ground running? And that'll be really important to tease that out right here. There'll be a second bucket that gets at these strategies requiring additional development. These are going to be the suite of strategies that we likely know we'll need for 2030 and then beyond for 2050, but we're not quite ready to sort of hit the ground with these. And so it'll be important to think about what those are, but then also tease out what's necessary to get us to finalizing those. And those will likely be the main strategies that then step up for the next climate action plan. So that'll put forward some work planning and thinking about how the council continues once we have this first climate action plan drafted. The additional consideration section below this really gets at the long-term vision for 2050. What is the mix of strategies and research and development that we still need to have to be considering in order to get at that really aggressive mitigation strategy for 2050? So this is the space to provide those under each strategy and recommendation to underscore the importance of that section. So that will be the mix for all of the mitigation task leads, as I suggested: buildings, electricity, ag and non-energy emissions. And then before we move on to sequestration, the idea here is then to speak to the cumulative assessment for 2025, and then also speak to how far the strategies for immediate implementation, as well as some of the strategies under that need additional research and recommendations, get us on the way to 2030. And this will really be where we highlight the work that'll be conducted through the RFP that's posted right now. And we'll be able to speak to the details of the, what that analysis tells us and how well we do with all of the recommendations that we put forward. Moving down below, sequestration. We spoke at Ag and Ecosystems around the titles here, and maybe as I finish up here, I'll allow others to correct me if I misrepresent that meeting. But the way that, just like above in the mitigation section, both for strategies for sequestration and for resiliency, I really broke it down by the task leads as well here, and it's not necessarily appropriate. And we've had some really good constructive conversation with rural resilience and adaptation about what's the more appropriate titles underneath each of those. But with Ag and Ecosystems, we didn't really get quite to that level of what's the suggested edits yet. And I think there will be coming out of that. But for now, we know that the main components underneath sequestration will be the work that we do with the carbon budget, and then how we use that going forward to inform strategies and policies for redoing the carbon budget on a regular interval, remembering that the carbon budget will really be a snapshot in time right now, and we'll likely want to repeat that. So thinking about how we do that. And again, just like above, there'll be strategies here for immediate implementation, ones that require additional development and additional considerations, all with the same components underneath them. And here I'll just speak to the cumulative impact, and what we want to do with sequestration is not as clear. Just how much detail we want to get at and how much we want to include in this first plan versus what's left to be further refined for the next plan. It's still unclear. And I think that will start to happen as Ag and Ecosystems really dives into work planning at their task lead level, which has just started to happen. There was really great effort around work planning at the subcommittee level last week. And here, this will provide a chance for them to all think about how far they want to take each of these titles and strategies and recommendations. So carbon budget, below that, we're thinking about forest and natural land sequestration. One of the ideas here is thinking about perhaps the carbon budget might fit underneath one of these headings and not need to stand alone. Again, we'll further refine that with the subcommittee. But then here we'll have breakout sequestration potential and strategies for both forest and natural lands, as well as agricultural land sequestration. And then thinking again about what is the cumulative assessment about with respect to the sequestration possibilities between those sectors, and above how the carbon budget informs that. So the last section really around the meat of
Can anyone else not hear her?
Yeah, I think, Jane, for some reason, we lost your audio.
I think she lost us too, because she's talking.
Yeah. Wait, hang on. Hold on, we can't hear you, Jane. Wait, time out. This is like Jane's burden to bear, is that Zoom hates her for some reason. It's just cruel. But while she's reconnecting to audio, you can see how this is repeating itself here as we talk about the strategies for resiliency and adaptation, with the same logic of having things that are ready to go on December 1st, at least in a draft form, and strategies are going to require some additional work. And I'll let Jane was more involved in the conversations last week that could provide some more nuance about these subheadings, whether it's nature-based solutions or what it's going to be. So we'll just give Jane a second to get back online and she can walk us through. And while she's doing that, I will say more broadly that the logic behind having, in particular, these two buckets of strategies for immediate implementation, strategies requiring additional development, it's a recognition that we will get as far as we can get on December 1st, and then we will have this ability to categorize things that say, these are great ideas, they require additional work that we haven't been able to do yet. And so it gives us that opportunity to be realistic about what's possible by December 1st statutory deadline. And at a bare minimum, we know from a mitigation standpoint that we need strategies for immediate implementation that will get us to 2025 on a mitigation standpoint and on the pathway to 2030. And we can talk about the things that we want as a bare minimum around resiliency and around sequestration as well. So again, Jane has this karma around Zoom. I hope I'm not responsible for it. I will say that I could just continue this presentation because I've been working with her on it. In the strategies for resiliency and adaptation, there's the subheadings right now as they stand as nature-based solutions, economic and food systems, community resilience, climate emergency preparedness, and community public health. I know that she was talking last week, maybe folks from the resilience, rural resilience subcommittee want to say a little bit about how this might have evolved even in the last week.
David,
So-
I'm happy to jump in on that.
Yeah,
We
please,
did have some really good conversation about that. And we provided some pretty substantive feedback just in our discussion. So when you look at, especially when you get, there was general agreement in the way that this is bucketed, but when you go down below a little bit, and we talk about the recommendations that we'll be needing to provide as it relates to these topic areas, we recognize that there's a need to define community resilience. And since we are the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, and there's a focus in the Global Warming Solutions Act on municipal or counter city resilience, I think we recognize that, but also recognize that there may be a broader intent from the council in the definition of community, and whether that includes certain community networks or organizational level supports that are available in some communities and not others, and how that qualifies or quantifies resilience in that town. So that was one topic area that we recognize. And one of the other things is that we probably need to build out some of these topic areas, such as infrastructure. So, when we talk about resilience, and we don't talk about infrastructure in the resilience and adaptation section of the climate action plan, I think it would be missing a substantive portion that would be expected from us. And then the last piece is under climate emergency preparedness. One piece of feedback that we provided is that when we talk about emergency preparedness, it's really defined in an all hazards context and not specific to one specific hazard. And really, climate change isn't really the hazard, it's fluvial erosion, inundation, flooding, ice, snow, wind. Those are specific hazards. And so we probably need to better define this category and recommendations related to overall emergency preparedness at the community or municipal level versus climate emergency preparedness.
Great.
So those were the highlights of our discussion.
That's great. Thanks, Erica. So I know Jane's trying to get back on, and I think we've actually gotten to a place where it'd be good to have a conversation. Oh, excellent. Wonderful, Jane. Before I pivot to a conversation, is there anything else you would want to mention? Erica just laid out some of the conversation you had last week. Is there anything else, Jane, you want to put out there before we open this up and get some feedback?
Well, I didn't hear the end.
Yeah.
And I'm now on my husband's phone because my phone died. Well, it didn't die, but it just lost service. And so hopefully thank you, Erica. I did pick back up as you were covering for me. So thank you very much. And I do just want to suggest that this is really a work in progress. And I'm anxious to hear what folks are thinking about and what we've missed and how it could be better reflected, and look forward to the conversation. So sorry about that. And hopefully we can pick right back up.
That's great. So there's a quick item in the chat I want to deal with. Jane, there's a question about whether there will be a specific section here on business as usual, or is that going to be embedded into the analysis of the mitigation strategies?
That is my understanding, the way I was thinking about it. But again, that would be really great to tease out here if there's a better. And then I suggest that also it could be built in within the discussion at the top around the effects of climate change on Vermont, and thinking about how we frame what would happen as we stay course consistent with the policies that we have in place right now, as well as recognizing things are changing as is.
Great. Okay. All right. So let's open it up here. And I think the real goal, right, is that an outline like this, or an evolution of this outline, provides us as much clarity as possible about what we're really trying to do by December 1st, right? That's what we're really trying to achieve here. We can make it, we're going to improve some, particularly the resilience section here, in terms of the headings and the content. And the question is, are we getting at that angst that we've all had about where are we really driving to on December 1st? So let me ask that question, everybody. How are we feeling about this outline getting us there? I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I'm happy to throw it back up if anybody wants to point out something, wants to put it back up. So how are we feeling about this kind of outline, providing the clarity we need to understand where we're getting to by December 1st? Initial reactions. Where are people's heads? In Zoom, you can raise your hand down below in the bottom bar. And it's an easy, since we're a relatively big group. However, if you can't find that, just unmute yourself and jump out and shout out. Jane, I see, Commissioner Attorney, please go ahead.
So I think it's an outstanding piece of work. And I think we're getting hung up on being a little too precious. This is a really good roadmap, and we need to move forward on the mission. So yay, thank you, Jane and all, and let's move out.
Excellent. Great. Thanks. Other reactions?
David,
Jane.
may I just suggest something?
Yeah.
Since I don't want to jump in, but I do just want to suggest that one of the things, and we'll start to get to this in our next conversation as well on the agenda, is just thinking about the timing of when we're going to know what. And this just stands as a brief update, but the RFP is still open for the technical analysis for the climate action plan. And we don't expect from the questions we've received on the technical analysis RFP, as well as just our understanding of like how long it took to get the contract in place with our communications consultants who will speak with us next, that we will have anybody on board till mid-May to end of May at the earliest, which just so we recognize that if what we're agreeing on with respect to the draft in front of us, we won't know certain things until much later than was originally put forward in the milestones. So I want that to sort of sit with folks to understand that the one major thing will be economic analysis. We won't have that until September at the earliest, but more likely October is when we'll start to get that information. And then the other thing, just thinking about as we think about this outline, is the role of engagement. And that will certainly get teed up and have a more robust conversation on next. But just understanding what we need to know and what we have to have in front of us to go out for public engagement, and how that then informs the timeline and the draft in front of us.
Thanks, Jane. Okay. Wow. People are a little quiet today. If I had to do just a quick thumbs up, we're going the right direction. I'm not so sure this is the wrong direction. Like, how are people? Just throw your thumb into the screen for a second. Like, we go in the right direction here with this? Okay, good. Feel free to be like, okay, good. I want to pick up on what Jane just said, because there is one piece of this that's interesting to test here while we're all together on this Zoom call, which is December 1st is a statutory requirement from the legislature that we would need to hit, or we do need to hit as a climate council. What December 1st is interesting though, because one of the ideas that I've heard floated around is that December 1st could be a draft full climate action plan. Again, I'm using that word draft. And the reason, if you use that word draft, it allows you to do additional public process and comment on the back end of December 1st, as opposed to having to do it in the months previous. So again, this is an idea I've heard floated around. We haven't talked about it as a full council. But what it would do is if you said, you know what, I'm going to interpret my statutory requirement to produce a climate action plan on December 1st as producing a draft plan, a fully baked draft plan. It'll give you a couple extra months to develop that draft plan, and then you can do public engagement on the backside of it in the winter. So I'd be curious to hear people's reactions to that idea that I've heard floated around. If that seems like a sensible way to ensure the subcommittees have time to do their work, ensure we get the economic and other analysis in a time frame that allows you to think about it. Any reactions to interpreting your mandate, your statutory mandate to be a draft action plan on December 1st? Any thoughts on that? Joey?
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. So I appreciate the direction we're going. A couple of thoughts would be just knowing that the legislature, their session, their work will be underway. So if some of the implementation strategies can give them a direction so that they can do further work next year, in the 2022 session, I think that would be important. I also would say, I know it seems to bump up against sort of the rulemaking requirements of the statute. So how that interfaces, I think would be something to consider. I certainly like the idea of doing this well, doing this right. And I see this plan being we will adopt a plan, but this process being, iterative. And I do think that there will be a need for greater public engagement once we have more, sort of meat on the bones of these strategies. So, I mean, I think generally that direction, but I would want to understand, and I don't know if you guys have any thoughts or have had conversations with, legislators in terms of how our work can inform the next legislative session. And especially, I don't know when this comes up, but I'm looking forward to the conversation about the federal dollars. That seems like if some of those dollars could go to really ground this work and leverage it, seems like a massive opportunity. And I don't know if there's something in the plan that speaks to that, or if we just send some other signal to the legislature about that opportunity. So some thoughts, a lot moving. I think generally a really good direction though.
That's great. Yeah. I wonder, if folks, maybe even Secretary Moore would want to speak to Joey's thoughts there, because absolutely, the idea is that by December 1st, there is an emerging set of ideas that others can run with, even as you're doing public engagement around them. But I don't know, not to put you on the spot necessarily, Secretary Moore, but when you think about Joey's questions about how this all becomes synchronizes with legislative session, with funding from federal dollars, any thoughts on that? And we will talk more specifically about the budgeting later.
Sure. No, happy to share some thoughts. And I think that there are a lot of challenges of timing in there. Certainly the ability to move directly into rulemaking is one piece. And then if there's statutory changes required. And I think we need to maybe separate those two. The rulemaking process, we have more flexibility on, and that the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules meets throughout the year. Whereas if any of the actions recommended in the climate action plan require legislative or statutory change, that timeline is obviously a little bit more narrow and limited to the legislative session. I think it's important to keep that in mind, and we'll provide a little bit of an update just in efforts to keep key legislators informed in some of the testimony that Chris Campany and Liz Miller and I provided a couple weeks ago in House Energy and Technology to that end. We are absolutely building the airplane as we're flying it here. And I think that's reflected in some of these timeline challenges. There are some really significant opportunities around federal funding. I think both in terms of the current America's Rescue Plan funding, or ARPA money that's available, as well as what may end up being a larger infrastructure package. And we'll need to keep eyes on those as they move through the process at the federal level and then at the state level. So it is an incredibly complicated landscape. And I think a lot of what Jane's laid out here this morning just reflects the reality of what we can accomplish by when, and recognizing the emphasis we want to place on public outreach and engagement, and ensure that there are adequate opportunities for that as well. So no perfect answers, but just honoring the fact that it is a really challenging and complicated landscape we're working on.
Thanks, that's helpful. Chris?
Just one thing to note, I unfortunately missed the presentation of the public outreach plan. I know we're talking about that later on in the agenda, but just quick, and I missed it. The second COVID vaccine kicked my butt. But what I think I'm seeing is that it kind of ends with the release of the report. I may be wrong, but I hope in any case, no matter where we're at in December, we're going to be planning on a lot of outreach and engagement after that report's released. Because if this is kind of a one and done kind of thing, like we develop a plan and then we kind of go, okay, we're not going to do much public outreach. David, I get what you're saying. I think you're saying go ahead and solicit more input for kind of the iterative process, but I think we're going to face a lot of challenges if also just in general, if we're thinking about releasing a plan and just kind of saying, okay, go to it. I think we're going to have to be back out where people are to talk to them about what's in that draft plan, even once it's not draft, right? Once it's adopted, to talk about it, because otherwise I don't think it'll be received very well. Because a lot of people, frankly, will not pay attention. Just having been in the planning world for a long time, a lot of times people don't pay any attention to a plan until it's actually adopted and enforced. And that's actually kind of when you need to get out and be doing a lot of work about what was actually in what you just adopted.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great segue to what we'll be talking about. Jane, do you want to say a word about that? And I actually have a word to say about that as well, but Jane, please.
Sure. Thank you. So, Chris, I think that's an excellent point. I do just want to sort of highlight, and I'm sure Sarika and the Climate Access folks, I see Sarika's on the call right now, will highlight this as well. But I do feel like the way, I just wanted to clearly articulate what's in the contract right now for outreach and engagement. Yes, I think that we need to have continual engagement and outreach and communication after the plan's adopted. That is not within the scope of the contract, though. I'll just say we have a director of communications too at A&R that will help, but and I'm sure there'll be a large conversation with all of you about how to support that work ongoing. But for now, the contract is thinking about three main touch points. And I think what I wanted to highlight with respect to this conversation is the final touch point, which is the third most concerted effort of public engagement around talking about the draft plan and what that would mean versus what David's floating with the December 1st deliverable being draft rather than final. If we stick with the milestones in front of us, as was presented and has been talked about before, we would have to have a complete final draft plan for that final piece of engagement by the end of September, beginning of October, to conduct the engagement and then finalize the plan by December 1st. And so what we're suggesting is allowing that space perhaps to have the draft plan in December and not be focused on engagement in the fall. So that I just want to highlight that, and that we'll dig deeper into that as we hear from our consultants and the Just Transition Subcommittee.
Right. Yeah, and the point is well taken that once you finalize a plan, whatever date that's going to be in, winter time or March or December 1st, depending on what you all decide, that requires a communication strategy and ongoing. I think A&R has that very clear in their heads. Okay, are there other reactions to the draft outline or this idea of talking about December 1 as a final draft plan, climate action plan? Are there other thoughts? Because I think it actually, when we talk about public engagement in the next section, this is important, right? Because the timing of this is, as Jane says, it's either you're out there doing a bunch of work on a draft plan starting late September, October, or you're doing it over the winter, and that has implications of how well you do it. Other thoughts on this? Okay, let me just test. Does anybody have a strong negative reaction to, with the caveats of Joey's comments, does anybody have a strong negative reaction to talking about December 1st as a final draft plan that gives you a chance to then go out and do good public engagement on it? Are there any strong negative feelings about that? Okay. Yeah, Joey.
Well, I don't have a strong negative feeling about that, but my question would be, and maybe we don't answer at this moment because there's a lot to process, as Secretary Moore just said, and I think we all recognize when we would have a final plan, like how much, what is that process? So we don't have to answer that in this moment, but I think, I do think that's just an important question to grapple with at some point.
Yeah. And I think the answer to that, Joy, is probably about the kind of the public engagement you want to do around it, the draft plan. So let's say you spent a couple months doing that. So then that would put you at the end of February, early March to have a final plan, right? Something along those lines would be probably reasonable. Okay, great. Anything else on this topic? Yeah, Jared?
It's not exactly on the draft, the final draft plan in that timeline, but if it's okay, before we move on to the next thing, I did want to go back a step and just provide a quick piece of feedback on the draft plan outline.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that okay to do now?
Yeah.
So first, I think it looks great, and thank you for the good work that's gone into it. I just have two very specific things, and they may be something we discuss further later, but just to flag for now. The first is that second letter that I think right now is kind of proposed as being a letter from the subcommittee chairs and co-chairs. If possible, I think it would be great, since this report will be coming from the full council, if that letter could come from the full council, especially given that it's a report to the legislature, and many members of the council were appointed by the either the House or the Senate. And then the other thing I would say is, in terms of the order of the mitigation strategies, they should probably be, and I'm sorry I didn't catch this earlier in our steering committee meeting, probably in order of the scale of their emissions reduction. And given that the statute says that each sector should be responsible for its proportional share or something like that of its emissions reduction, that would likely mean that agriculture as a sector would be the third section because it has been our third highest emitting sector after transportation and thermal fuel use, or what we've called buildings in this report. So just that, suggesting that slight reordering so that we're in order of the scale of the emissions reductions we're proposing.
Okay, great. That's helpful. So letter from the full council at the top, it seems like the right strategy, and then getting that order right in terms of relative mitigation. Okay, thanks. That's helpful, Jared. Abby, and then Catherine.
I'm trying to think of the right way to frame this, but I understand that we're contending with a climate emergency and things like that, but I do feel like I just have to say there are a lot of people in Vermont who are already in a state of emergency, and I just think the legislators and the administration ultimately work for the people of Vermont. And so if the people of Vermont, I assume we will be talking about this as we move into public engagement and the presentation from Just Transitions, but if our citizenry doesn't feel adequately represented in this and doesn't feel like they've had adequate outreach, deadlines become, in my opinion or my view, superfluous. We have to have people on board to move forward, and they have to have been engaged with along the process so that they feel invested in this, or this, as I see it, will ultimately fail. And so I just feel like I have to put that out there somewhere.
It's such a good segue as well, Abby, into the next section. So I want to keep that comment very alive as we're talking about public engagement in the next section, and to see if it's feeling like we're setting ourselves up for success. So let's keep that very much alive as we pivot into the next section in just a second. Catherine?
A couple of things. One is I was going to make a comment similar to Abby's, which is that if we do achieve and decide that the December 1st draft is our goal, that I hope that our fall public engagement is at least as robust as it would have been should we be presenting a draft plan in the fall. And that gives us an opportunity to almost double our robust public engagement. So from that perspective, I think the December 1st as a draft goal is really attractive to me because it does give us that opportunity. In terms of the outline itself, I'll apologize because I was away and missed our subcommittee meeting. So I don't know if we talked about this at the subcommittee, but it seems like the rural resilience charge to look at best practices for reducing fossil fuel consumption in the municipal, school district, and residential areas with really a focus on rural almost belongs in the mitigation section rather than the resilience section. And I don't know if there's a way to incorporate a special analysis for those best practices and for the rural considerations in the mitigation section. So I'll just throw that out there as a suggestion.
Thanks, Catherine. And I'm glad you did, because it is one of those things where it's a little confusing. Where's the right place for it? And so I'm glad you put that out there. Maybe there's some creative way to deal with that overlap. I will say that the structure of the report does not have to be perfectly aligned with the structure of the subcommittees, right? We can make the report fit the way we want the narrative to fit. It doesn't have to be, oh, that was rural resilience, it needs to be in this part of the report. We're not wedded to that at all. Great. Okay. Wonderful. And the other point, Catherine, I'll just say quickly, what I hope we'll talk about now on public engagement is these different touch points of public engagement, right? One, like right now, early engagement, particularly with publics and folks who don't typically get involved in these kinds of conversations. Then a second touch point around when we have some emerging draft ideas from subcommittees, right? Which could be in the summer and the fall, right? And then a third when we have a fully, put together draft climate action plan, right? So those are different touch points where you could be out talking to folks in creative ways. And we look forward to hearing our colleagues talk about that in just a second. Okay. Anything else before we move into this next conversation?
David, just one more comment on the outline.
Yeah.
One thing that it occurs to me that and maybe this is even a distillation of the draft plan, but it seems to me that it'd be helpful to have kind of a I don't know, lack of a better term, kind of a real world implementation section or report that basically says, okay, out of all of this, what does this generally mean for households, businesses, local governments, that kind of thing. And what I'm talking about there, like real, just basic, an item that keeps coming to my mind. This is a little thing, but it can add up to a big thing. Is like, okay, based on what we're proposing, are we generally talking every home in Vermont is going to have 200 amp service? And then what does that mean? And I know that that's like a little thing and it's getting into the weeds, but I think that's some of the important stuff that we're going to need, that we should, for the public, be able to drill down into, as far as like what some of the practical effects are going to be in kind of household, business, and especially local government life, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Well, let's see how we could do that. That sort of really practical look of what we're talking about and do it from the household level. Interesting. Okay. All right. I will just note that as a conclusion of that section, overall, we heard a lot of enthusiasm about the way that draft outline is being put together and some good suggestions about improving it. Overall, we're hearing from an initial take that it feels probably smart to use December 1st as a draft deliverable of the climate action plan. Let's keep mulling that over. We can circle back at the end of the meeting as well. But I'm hearing that. I just want to note that. And let's take that into the next section now when we talk about public engagement. Okay. All right. So our next piece here is talking about public engagement, and we're going to do it in sort of two steps. First, we're going to have some of our co-chairs from Just Transitions give us some opening thoughts about where the Just Transitions subcommittee is at, both in terms of public engagement, in terms of principles, and how those intersect, and give us some opening thoughts about that. Then we're going to have the consultants who are now on board, who are Climate Access and their partners, Rise Consulting, give us a walkthrough of what they understand they're going to be doing in terms of public engagement and these different touch points that I mentioned, and how they see that happening. And then we're going to have a conversation about all that and how we're feeling about it. All right, so that's our two-step process now to have this conversation around public engagement, and we're going to really center it around the work of Just Transitions subcommittee. Okay, so why don't I turn it over to the co-chairs of the Just Transitions subcommittee to get us going. And I know, Sue, you were going to take the lead in that, though perhaps you can recognize your colleagues who are on the phone on the Zoom call with us right now.
Absolutely. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're great.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Happy spring, I think. Yeah, I thank you so much, David, and everyone. Just wanted to kind of start our presentation by saying a few words about the context of the work we're doing, and then turn it to my co-chairs, Sarah Phillips from the Office of Economic Opportunity, Kaya Morris from Rights and Democracy. And we're going to offer a little bit more details on our work in the subcommittee, and then turn it to the public engagement consultants. I do want to recognize our fourth co-chair, who is Nadia Pops, who is not able to be here this morning, but has been a tremendous asset to all of our work. And I feel that our foursome is really fortunate to have the collective talents and expertise that we're trying to bring to this process. You know, I know it is stating the obvious, but I think it's important to bring to this conversation that these are extraordinary times, and we are all coming together in our work to address the climate crisis in the middle of an unprecedented global pandemic and an unfolding economic crisis that further exacerbates pre-pandemic economic disparities. And also to emphasize, we are doing this during an historic moment of racial reckoning in our country. And I think we all know that the Global Warming Solutions Act here in Vermont that established our council explicitly recognized both the urgent need to address the climate crisis and the need to do it in a manner that recognizes the need to redress the social, economic, and racial disparity by including our just transition for what we see or propose as a sustainable and green energy future. So our subcommittee has been exploring what this all means. We've been doing a review of all of the work of our neighboring states. We sponsored a workshop on environmental justice that I'm grateful that many of you were able to attend, and we do have the recording on our site. I encourage you to check it out. But we also really did this in the formation of our Just Transition Subcommittee. We really reached out to with the hopes of becoming a subcommittee inclusive of a range of voices and communities, especially vulnerable Vermonters who are disproportionately impacted by our changing climate, and whose voice and perspective we don't often hear from, and we seek to engage and learn from. So we're really pleased, grateful for the members of our subcommittee, which includes a rich array of community voices, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, labor, low income, youth. We're not inclusive of every voice, but we're trying to really listen. And we're learning a lot from one another, and we're really working hard to make progress on really what are our two main charges. First, creating guiding principles to provide an equity lens to this work we're all doing. And then second, to help guide an inclusive public engagement process, just like we've been talking about already this morning. So you're going to hear from Sarah and the consulting team more on the process and guiding principles. And I want to just emphasize before handing it to Sarah that we believe this inclusive and respectful engagement and dialogue is relevant not only to our external, but also our internal engagement. So I just want to point out some issues that have been shared, some concerns really that have been shared by our subcommittees who are joining some of your subcommittees in this work, who are observing challenges to allowing all voices to be heard. So we are working hard on developing recommendations for guiding our principles that we do hope to provide for you by early May. But we're also going to recommend to the steering committee that we establish a specific training for the full council to address our own awareness, self-awareness, and that training is about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So we want us to take that on as a council in the very near future. So I just wanted to share some of that context and now hand it to Sarah to describe a little bit more about our internal processes in the subcommittee. And then to Kaya, who's going to share some specific concerns raised by the BIPOC community that are directed to the full council for our consideration, and then hand it over to Climate Access and RISE Consulting to walk through the plan for our external public engagement process. Thanks. Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. That was a really nice way that you framed that up for us. And I think that folks can hear me. Okay, great. Thanks.
Good.
So I think, I think, Sue, your point is well taken in terms of just the way our own subcommittee is bringing folks together and working to create space for a number of voices to come forward and really, I think, inform and shape how we do this work together, which is really, I think, as Sue was pointing out, fundamental in terms of us getting to the ultimate goal. I think it was Abby's point that was earlier made that is very alive in our committee, I just want to say, around this idea that the transformative change that we're working towards really requires full participation, and full participation requires real, deep engagement and thoughtful process. So the idea that process is somehow separate from impact for us as a committee is very, very alive and well in terms of how we're approaching our work. I think one of the things that we realized very quickly on as we started to want to dive into these questions around public engagement and guiding principles and looking at the work of other areas and across the regions, which we are doing, is that we also needed to very consciously work to slow down and just create space for deeper listening and sharing and reflection and listening, and that we needed to earn the trust of members of our group, right? That was like fundamental to our work. And so we did that, and we wanted to share with you all a couple ways that we did that we thought were really helpful. We're still learning and figuring out how to incorporate it, but we think they're working, they're achieving these goals. One is to create a member spotlight opportunity where it's voluntary, but a member can come forward and share in just a few minutes, like their own experience, both professional and personal, and what they're bringing to this climate action space. And again, from a voluntary perspective, but just recognizing that we're all coming with lived experience and we're all bringing that value to the work that we're doing together. So we created conscious space in our subcommittees to do that kind of work. The other thing that we've been working on is creating a session to really do what we're calling a community listen session. And this is a little bit different than saying, I'm coming and here's what I'm personally and professionally bringing to this work, but here's a community that I'm seeking to represent in this work, or represent might not even be the best word, but really lift up voices, with the voices of this community within our work, and to share a little bit of those voices within the committee space, again, just for subcommittee members to have a deeper listen and understand those different ways of knowing and being and what those communities are bringing to the space, and then have some reflection time after that. So we're still tweaking and playing with those ideas, but we wanted to share them with this full council so you could understand how we're trying to truly live into this work that we're talking about around what it means to engage as a subcommittee in this work. And then I think just to say that we really, I think just to reemphasize Sue's point, is that respectful, deep public engagement is actually, although it's a distinct set of work that we're deeply engaged in, is really core to what our just transitions guiding principles are. They're not really separate. And so that's, we fully intend to be working really closely with Climate Access and RISE in their work throughout the process. And then I think the last point, again, and it feels a little bit repetitive, but I feel like sometimes that's okay, is to just say that we feel this really inherent tension between a respectful, deep engagement process and this rush to develop this climate action plan. And that comes out continuously in our subcommittee process. And so, I think we're really thoughtful in the need to move forward and to not slow down, but also slow down enough so that what we're doing is meaningful and has the opportunity for all Vermonters to participate. So this is off script a little bit, but I just wanted to recognize that we have some other members of our Just Transition Subcommittee that are here today on the full Climate Council, and I want to make sure that what I'm saying is reflecting sort of the conversations that we've had. So I'm thinking about Iris and Chris, and I know Nadia is listening in as she's juggling work responsibilities today, and Kaya's going to speak in a moment, but Iris and Chris, just want to make sure that's reflecting our work together. Okay, great. And David, I know you had prepared like a slide that just kind of looked at a couple of things around our process and our conversations. Did you want me to walk through those and share those?
If it feels like useful right now, yes, or turn to Kaya's comments, I think are really a key piece to go right now. So I think if you want to say the subcommittee has had conversation around public engagement in two sessions. And so if you want to share some of those, you can now, or before you turn it over to the consultant.
Yeah, why don't I turn it to Kaya and then we can flip back and just share a couple of those slides, and that'll be a nice transition into talking about inviting climate access and RISE. Great.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Kaya Morris. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak with you all today. So really in this portion, I wanted to be able to take an opportunity to lift up the need for us to reconfigure how we go about this process. While we recognize that this is coming from a mandate from our government, right? It's through a state body. It's one that directly impacts the lives of individuals up and down the state. And as that work is necessary to mitigate our climate crisis, it must also heal our communities. One of the challenges that we face when we think about this work is we're always on this drive to reach what we want to call climate or environmental equity. But there, inherent within that is a lack of recognition of the fact that there are many who are deeply harmed. And it is true globally, as you all are experts in this work, that in particular, individuals who are considered BIPOC or people of the global majority are most directly impacted by our climate crises, although they're the least contributors to those causes. And so until those communities are brought whole, we can't ever reach equity. We're just reaching on a same wavelength that still leaves others behind. So I think what's important for me to share in this quick moment, and then I'd love to be able to, I'll lead into a little bit of a letter that I think you all have seen or has been shared with the different committee chairs. But before I do that, I feel it's very important that we provide a land acknowledgement. And I want you to hear this, and I want you to know that this is something that you can do. And especially as individuals that might consider themselves to be white, if you are in leadership positions, when you are in these public forums, providing a land acknowledgement is just the smallest modicum of a way of acknowledging that there is a history that we are here today impacting. And until we reconcile with our past, we won't be able to move forward into a just future. So I want to just recognize that the Climate Council is here today, and that we are acknowledging the Mohican in southern Vermont and the Abenaki peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Indakana, which includes parts of Vermont, New England, and Quebec. As guests on the unceded territory of the Mohican and Abenaki peoples, we honor their ancestors, their elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge that our nation has benefited from the uncompensated and exploited labor represented in the legacy of slavery and the present-day reality of migrant farm workers. So before I share with you this letter, I did want to share with you a little bit of my origin story on how I ended up on the subcommittee. So one of the things I realized when the Global Warming Solutions Act came through and the Climate Council was listed, I was like, wow, this is great. This is intense. There's this really insane timeline that we're trying to meet, goals that we're trying to meet. Let's see who's on this roster. And I went through and realized how it was just the complete opposite of a diverse future. When we're thinking about the solutions, when we're thinking about the needs of those most impacted, those folks were just not on that list. They were just absolutely not on that list. And having done work that I feel honored to be a central part of within both our state and regionally, came to realize that the lack of voice was going to mean that we would fail on what we were purporting to do if we were not able to change and shift this. So within my role at Rights and Democracy as the Movement Politics Director, and Rights and Democracy, just so that you're familiar, we cover both Vermont and New Hampshire. And we're part of a regional table called the Renew New England Alliance, where there are states, every single state in New England has put forth in collaboration with over 150 different nonprofits and organizations throughout the state to push forth a bold climate action plan. And within this, we have a really robust and engaged eye towards just transition, towards thinking about a future that is just and equitable for all, that meets both our needs and that helps to create a thriving future. But one of the things we realized as we began this group that started just in January of 2020 was that as we were starting to take off on that breakneck speed that we always do within government, that we must get these bills passed, we got to get these rules across, we got to get these things done, we were suddenly hit with the novel coronavirus. And then we were hit with George Floyd. And then we were hit with Breonna Taylor. And we realized that our BIPOC folks that were in this very work, we couldn't even guarantee they were all being paid to do the work that they were doing, to address the climate crisis that they did not cause, to do the work on behalf of the states that they lived in that should have been done, that they are doing this labor. And we're not even being recognized for the fact that they're also out doing mutual aid and raising their kids at home and doing homeschooling and doing elder and care and. And there was a need to stop and centralize to make sure that the plans that we were putting forth were even reflective of our needs, hopes, desires, and demands. And we could not find that alignment. So it gave us a chance to make a wake-up call to say, we need to change this. So within Vermont and New Hampshire, with Rights and Democracy made a mission to say that within the work that we're going to do for our statewide coalitions to push forth this proposal, that we would build out a table of folks from most impacted communities that is centralized on racial justice to drive forth and bring across this work. One of the other things that you should know, and just to, again, someone said it earlier, how are we going to be able to build trust? It's really difficult to build trust if you are not actually seen as a whole person within these problems, if you are not honored for your subject matter expertise. But one of the things that I heard when I questioned about the composition of those that were in the Climate Council itself was we couldn't find anybody. We didn't know of any BIPOC folks that were working in climate or environmental justice. In a matter of a few emails, I had over almost 24 different prospects from throughout the state of subject matter experts working long before y'all ever knew their names within the world of climate and environmental justice. And these folks come together in an affinity space, and we are directly impacting many of the policies that you're thinking about right now. We are helping to work with folks like Senator Ram, work with groups like Rejoice, University of Vermont, on a number of the different tools that are going to be absolutely crucial for this work to have meaning and be successful. So I'm just going to take a moment more. I am taking up space. I am taking up space and time, and I'm unapologetic about that because this is important. So I am going to share with you the letter that the Renews BIPOC Council has pulled together. Just as we were looking at the work that we were trying to do and as we were seeing in the work of the Climate Council and of the state of Vermont. So we write this letter as members of the Vermont Renews BIPOC Council, a collective of experts in environmental justice advising and supporting the Vermont Renews Project and the Renew New England platform. The Renew New England Alliance is a new and growing coalition of more than 150 leading grassroots organizations, labor unions, racial justice groups, frontline communities, and environmental advocates. And we've come together to address our region's overlapping crises: mass unemployment, racial injustice, the coronavirus pandemic, and climate change. Vermont Renews itself has a robust statewide partnership that is collectively developing bill proposals for the state in the areas of housing justice, food justice, and what are called green justice zones. The Vermont Renews BIPOC Council, which includes more than a dozen members from across the state, was established because Black, Indigenous, and people of color and those facing systemic inequalities are disproportionately affected by environmental injustices, including climate change. The negative impacts of this crisis are lethal to our communities. Because we have borne so much of the burden of injustice, the work of addressing our climate crisis should primarily center on the needs, the experiences, and the voices of our BIPOC and other socially marginalized communities. Furthermore, any policies and processes intended to mitigate the climate crisis should be designed to heal the generational harms of white supremacy and other extractive societal structures. In 2020, the world was shaken due to the novel coronavirus. The experience of COVID added an additional layer to the cumulative burdens of disproportionately placed on BIPOC and low-income communities. The pandemic also affected our approach to our work in significant ways. One of the most crucial being the ability to share actual space, to dialogue, and to come into community with one another. Deliberative, intimate dialogue is central to different ways of being and of learning and of listening to each other and honoring our varied cultural norms and ways of being. What we have found is that the pandemic has thrown our best laid plans into a challenging space that increases the pressure to continue on an accelerated time frame, determined and enacted without due public engagement of those most infected. Our communities have made it clear that no decisions about our lives should be made without our direct engagement. And this demand requires that the state be responsive to procedural justice, which means being inclusive, responsive, and intentionally listening and engaging in dialogue, self-care, and the healing of our communities as we navigate these challenges. And although we don't want to slow down our overall response to climate change, the processes must move forward in a way that centers meaningful engagement of the communities that are most impacted by those challenges. We are in the midst of reckoning around systemic racism and white supremacy in our nation, and this work is challenging. It is mentally, physically, and emotionally taxing for us to manage. It is for this reason that we feel we must raise concerns around the ways that the state is responding to environmental justice and its engagement with BIPOC experts. The demands that the state makes places an exceptionally high toll on BIPOC individuals in Vermont because of the lack of commitment on the part of the state to effectively engage our communities by taking that input in meaningful ways that will lead towards solutions that further the most disadvantaged communities and populations in our state. And we need space to ensure that this work is healing, because any work that is not healing for BIPOC communities and the leaders actually doing the work, it is the wrong work. We need the space to explore the policy demands to ensure that they actually do reflect the needs of our communities. There are times in which the differences within our communities may produce competing desires. We believe it requires having deep conversations and building relationships that allow us to be in solidarity with one another and not working in conflict with each other. Most of the experts that are doing this work are asked to provide significant labor to meet the state's demands while being unpaid or undercompensated for this very labor, which again is for our benefit, but it's also for the state. So in response to these concerns, we wish to state the following expectations for policies that are under consideration: that the state commits to meaningfully pursuing procedural justice so that BIPOC subject matter experts may engage in these processes in ways that enable us to take better care of ourselves and our communities. That the state apply racial justice vision, policy, and leadership in addressing the climate crisis with COVID responsive decisiveness. We did it once, we can do it again. That any jobs created from new or existing policies to address the climate crisis will pay a living wage of a minimum of $15 an hour or the prevailing wage and support organized labor. That racial justice and equity is central to any proposals made, and that the state explicitly prioritize most impacted communities in the production of these mandates. That the state make an unequivocal commitment to the immediate cessation of ongoing environmental harms identified as the state works towards strategies to restoration and revitalization. And that the Climate Council's decision-making body recognizes that the advisory subcommittees do not resolve or adequately compensate for exclusion and gross inequity in appointments. Therefore, subcommittee members must have a vote on their committee and meaningful role in decision-making throughout. Moreover, future nomination processes must be significantly more inclusive, allowing for true representation in decision-making roles from most impacted communities. That it be further recognized that the continued segregation of BIPOC leaders within advisory roles upholds the narrative of white supremacy. It stifles the ability of the Climate Council to effectively arrive at impactful climate decisions that also protect BIPOC communities. And finally, that the policies brought forth by BIPOC communities to address the climate crisis be meaningfully reviewed and considered as a priority within committees of jurisdiction. We know what we need, and many of us have already been working towards it. So here's an opportunity for us to breathe through this and for us to do the real important work that's necessary right now. We are leaders in this country. Let's keep that up. Let's show them how it's done. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaya. That's really powerful. That letter was sent to all of you on Friday afternoon by Jane, so you have a copy of it. So rather than pivoting straight into the consultant work on public engagement, I wonder if we do want to just do a quick pause on this. And if there's anything that needs first that co-chairs from the Just Transition Subcommittee want to say to round out this piece. and other reactions from council members from what we're hearing here about what's going on in just transitions in that letter that Kaya and her group have sent around. So first to Sue and Sarah, are there other things you want to say on this piece right now?
Well, I want to just mention, thank you, Kaya, and obviously there's a lot in the letter and a lot behind it and within it. One thought I do have just to share is the construct in which we are set up with our subcommittee over here and not really embedded in the work that you all do. And I know we've discussed that, but I think we're going to discuss with the group once we have our principles shared with you and we consider them draft and somewhat of an iterative guidance. We will maybe spend much less time together as a group and really focus on integrating into your other subcommittees, because the whole construct, even though it was set up this way by the legislature, I think it is not leading us in the right direction. So I just wanted to reiterate that thought in terms of structure and process that was pointed out, I think, really eloquently in the letter.
Great, thanks. And as Jane says in the chat, this topic and what it means for how you all as a council function and how your subcommittees function, and also flagging what Sue said earlier about this recommendation of increasing everybody's capacity around these issues. That's something that the steering committee is going to take up right away and see if there's some actionable things. Are there pieces that you all as a council want to say right now ahead of that? Are there pieces that we want to put on the table right now, reactions that you're having as you're listening to this?
So I'll just speak up. I definitely would welcome some more engagement with the Just Transitions subcommittee for sure. The Resilience and Adaptation subcommittee are missing those voices. And, when we look at the fact that we're making recommendations for building resilience into Vermont communities, if we don't have those voices at the table, then that we are remiss. And and Catherine and I have talked about that at length, and would welcome wholeheartedly any feedback on how we can better our engagement with the BIPOC community and make sure that those voices are at the table and heard and appreciated.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Commissioner Turney?
Thank you. I'm finding it very difficult to continue this conversation without taking a moment to acknowledge the power and the force of the voice that Kia Morris just gave to that letter. I read the letter before the meeting, and it didn't come across the way it came across when it was infused with her remarkable spiritual elevation of the points. And it just leaves me feeling a little bit like we're proceeding with a very workmanlike pace and disposition. And it's not clear to me that we have, well, I'll speak for myself, that I've really fully understood what I was just told. So if Ms. Morris doesn't mind, I'd like to ask you a question. My memory is you have a background as a legislator, and it's not clear to me whether your critique goes to how this committee is setting up to do the work of the legislature, or whether the critique goes deeper and says that these voices were not heard in the first instance when the legislature itself was enacted. I'm just wondering, because I remember at the very outset of our meetings, we had Susanna Davis in to speak to our group, and she very forcefully said something similar to what you just said, if my memory serves, which is we need to slow down because a deadline that moves us to move past important voices is a deadline that lacks legitimacy. I'm paraphrasing. But to go to my question to you, could you clarify for me at this point where you think the corrective needs to start?
I appreciate that. So I think the best way to consider this is that this Climate Council came into being through the Global Warming Solutions Act, which came into being from the activism and the organization of most of our large environmental groups here in the state of Vermont. Those groups, they in themselves are overwhelmingly monolithic. They are white. There are no leaders of those organizations that represent BIPOC communities. And if there are BIPOC staff, they're junior staff, they're usually underpaid. So this work came into being, and even in the spaces where we've tried to have influence, where BIPOC have tried to have influence on some of these decisions, they've been kind of treated as a novelty and as being less important, being deemed as it's, oh, that's great that you're trying to do this equality work, but electric bicycles are the way to go. That never came from anybody in our community saying, oh my gosh, is that actually what you want? Nobody ever said that. We had no buy-in to it because we weren't ever engaged in these processes. And it's very easy, as a former legislator, I do understand very well the pressures that are happening. And when you want to have these opportunities, you want to take these opportunities, like the Global Warming Solutions Act, it needed to pass in the time that it passed in order for it to pass. I understand that very fully, but there also has to be a willingness to be like, and we totally had to leave an entire sector of our communities behind. There are full-on sections of our state that we're just not going to be able to go along for this ride because we had to get it done. So then once it was done, then we had it, and there was these arbitrary timelines that you must have this Climate Council convened by the certain date, which then meant that people were not going to be able to be involved. And you're also dealing with the state within a moment of racial reckoning, where when we have had BIPOC folks step into these spaces of power, they're overworked, they're overtaxed, they're in 15 meetings, and they're barely getting paid to do so. And it is too much. So as people were even looking at who can we get appointed to all of these different appointments, many BIPOC are like, I'm not your free labor anymore. Like that's, we're done with that. We're trying to like move past that life of being able to utilize our labor, our wisdom, and our expertise for free or next to free at your demand and at your whims that are not actually reflective of what we are capable and what makes sense for us. There's also some problems within that as well. When we think about the timeline, and I appreciate you asking this as well, when we're thinking about the timeline and what it means, the other component of the slowing down, it is not that people do not have an ability to understand deeply technical language. Like that's, you know, whatever. That's the least important part of it. What it is that many of us have different ways of being and understanding the world that we work within, that we need to be able to take that information and translate it back to the communities that we are coming from. And if we cannot clearly unpack these in ways that will have meaning so that people can buy on, then that's going to be a problem. And so that often takes enough time and enough space to be in a space, to a time and space to be able to be in a place where you can breathe through it and really feel like you understand it and you can critique it, ask questions of it, praise it, or enhance it, whatever that work needs to be. So that's really where this came from. And again, this letter, these were folks that have been doing this work. They've been doing this frontline work. Y'all just didn't know them. This just as a state, we were not in community with them. And so now they were, and they were very eager to be in this space, to be able to do this work. So, but this was what came from that heart center out of that group and the voice of that group.
So I risk putting you on the spot, but is there a specific corrective action you would recommend to us at this point, having joined our meeting today and seen how we function?
I would definitely go back, take more time to meditate over the letter. There's definitely going to be, there'll be more comments that will come very shortly, I believe, as well, thinking about what that means for training. For those that are, the subcommittee, or the Just Transition Subcommittee has a really diverse body, and I really credit the chairs that are there for really trying to go out and recruit as much as possible. We didn't see that breadth happen across many of the other committees. And so for those individuals who do have differing identities, it's a struggle for them to be in those spaces and to not feel like they're either tokenized or that they're diminished. And so we just don't have that. So there's going to necessarily be important work. And I believe that the work that Rise Consulting will talk about and how we might be able to do public-private partnerships on really expanding the scope of that work so that we can really try to make we do our best. Do our best. We
Oh.
you know better. Now, if you know better, do better. Right? Isn't that
Well, thank you
what the
for
phrase
that.
is?
Your remarks hold particular sway with me, given your own familiarity with our legislature.
Mhm.
And I hope you can see that with our steering committee taking the letter up, that's about the most powerful next step I can think of, because that means at the very core of our group, your
Mhm.
message is going to be, looked at carefully and then filtered down to the rest of us, in
Mhm.
addition to our own independent thinking. So thank you. And I hope I haven't transgressed too much here in our discussion norms. Back to our moderator, I think.
Thank you.
All righty.
David, you're muted.
Thanks. I saw that Secretary Moore also wanted to speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect back comments I think Sue made about having the just transition team sort of more fully integrated into the technical work of the subcommittees. I think that that's essential. I think that these are complex conversations, and to think that it could be applied on the top after the fact as opposed to fully integrating it in from the base is a mistake, and look forward to understanding and thinking through better how that can be made to work, because I think not just having that articulation of principles, but then to have it be fully integrated into the science and technical work of each of the subcommittees is going to be essential to having the types of products that Kaya was speaking to.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Yeah, I really do hope, I don't know how the letter's sitting with folk, but, I can just say, as a white male, I hear reflected the truth of what was in that letter. And I could just say, one of the things that struck me moving to Vermont from the South, which God knows, I mean, South breaks my heart every day, but one of the things that struck me moving to Vermont is that when I've brought up issues like this, about inclusion, about racial equity and justice, and God knows I've got a lot of work to do on myself and for myself, and I'm not saying that I've got the answers, but frequently what I would hear is Vermont doesn't have this problem, because Vermont, either sometimes it's in the context of Vermont doesn't have minorities, therefore it's just not an issue for us, or Vermont is progressive enough that we make sure all the voices are included and we do the right thing, and we're kind of an exceptional state in that regard. And I just want us, in the Just Transition Subcommittee, one of the things that I'm fortunate to be on that subcommittee, and it's been a bit of a bubble. The bubble's gonna burst, and we'll be bringing this work back out to the larger council, and you'll hear the conversations that we've been having, and oftentimes they're really difficult and painful. Especially if you're, part of the folk with privilege to hear, but by God, we need to hear and we need to respond to it. But I hope folk won't just see this letter and go, "That's nice," and just move on to business as usual, because the truth there, the truth is there. And one of the challenges that I have is just wrapping. One of the things, again, being in the Just Transitions group, is what I keep thinking is, man, I've not seen Vermont or many other places do this, everything that we're proposing for just transitions at all. So we're expecting this council to do a lot of groundbreaking work, not just in climate, but just in process and procedure and inclusion. And I think that's an awesome thing. It could, quite frankly, be revolutionary. But I don't really see a lot of, precedent to draw upon. And maybe it's there and I'm just missing it. And I'm not talking about just Vermont. I'm talking, in terms of public policy and public policy implementation generally. So, but I really do hope folk will just, again, not just take this as a letter, say that's nice, and then, roll on. And it may take a while to digest. This work takes a long time to do. And yeah, but Kai, thank you so much for sharing that and doing that good work.
Thanks, Chris. Secretary Young?
I'll defer first to Commissioner Walk.
Great. Thanks. Peter?
Thanks, David. Kai, I appreciate you being here and sharing that with us. I think as co-chair of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, our subcommittee is really where the rubber meets the road, where the policy has to emerge around how we meet our emissions reductions. And we have been feeling very much like we're on a path to bring up all of the usual suspects in terms of policy development. And some of those are well thought out and well thought through, and some of them are the things that we have always done and we have always gone to, and had been feeling very anxious about the fact that we don't have a set of principles and a set of guideposts for us all to work with. And yet, sort of based on the timeline that we've got working for us, we have kind of mid-May to come up with a draft set of initial policy recommendations. And we haven't done any, just thinking about the agricultural space, which we've had several conversations around, and think about the conversation we had last week, Abby, about the fact that we need to talk with lots of different groups and communities about what some of the implications of these various policies might be. And there isn't time. And so we always go to what our best effort is, but this structure is missing that opportunity. And so I guess it sort of speaks to the draft, timeline of having a draft report in December, that we spend more time now getting our initial outreach done well and continuously, so that we can build it into what the policies look like. Because as we know, the technical analysis isn't going to be ready for some time anyways. And so we have time to pause and breathe and understand where we're going. So I would just, and as the sort of tip of the spear, as it were, on the policy development idea, that's where my level of discomfort comes from. And that's why I just wanted to share that as a reflection on Kai's works. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Secretary Young?
Thank you. Thank you to the co-chairs of the Just Transitions subcommittee. That your work is so important, and Kaya, I think you really just brought it home to all of us in a very, very concise and powerful way. Again, I'll just maybe try to wrap this up, and then we can see where your subcommittee is recommending we go. We all should meditate on the letter more, as you suggest. But again, you think we've all heard in so many different aspects of this work, the timelines are not realistic. The timelines, are keeping us from really doing the best work that we can do in all of these, with all of these factors. And so I appreciate the fact that, we feel comfortable with an interpretation of the statute that allows us to do this in an iterative process, to do this in a draft process, and to really work forward to something that gets us through at least 2025 with a draft action plan this fall, and building on that as we meet. And also that the engagement of the subcommittees with the Just Transition Subcommittee, I think, is going to be key, and to start getting that work out into all facets of this work. And then just finally, it brings, Chris, your suggestion before that, our plan, talk about real life impacts on communities and individuals. This is where, again, I think building on that, on the other many communities, not just the rural communities, but the BIPOC community and beyond. So I really support your notion of having a real impact section of the plan that could be address many of the issues that we've been talking about today. So with that, thank you.
That's great. That's great. Thanks. Leslie Ann, I see your hand.
Yes, good morning. I just wanted to put out a personal note of thanks to Kaya, because I know how much it takes to actually be in this space and to share what she just shared. So I just want to thank her for her intersectionality, Kaya. I know what this means. I know all the subtext that is going on. And so I just want to give you a shout out from the bottom of my heart. So thank you.
That's great. Okay. All right. So in the spirit of time and giving it enough time, we did give this time, and that's meant that we're going to be behind today. And that's okay, right? We actually have time at the end of the meeting that we can take from. I do think we should hear from our consultants before we take a break. I think we should hear from what the plan is for public engagement. And this set us up for a much better way to interpret this, having had this conversation. So let's hear from our folks, our colleagues at Climate Access and Rise Consulting, to hear how they're understanding their mandate for public engagement. And then let's take a break, come back, do some public comment around that, and then move on with the rest of our agenda. So unless Sarah and Sue and Kaya, you'd want to say something more about what the subcommittee has said about participation before we pivot into our consultants, I'll turn it over to them. But Sarah and Sue and Kaya, do you want to say anything more about how public participation has been part of the conversation so far in Just Transitions?
I don't know that we need to add more. We've had a great conversation. I do want to say that we did meet with Climate Access and Rise to get sort of a presentation. We've had a bit of a reflection, but we really anticipate being a part of this going forward as well. And we really thank them for their, I think, really innovative work to try to take all of this in and move us forward. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so let's make a pivot. And Cameron, while I'm introducing, can you make sure everyone could screen share? That'd be great. So from Climate Access, we have two folks with us. Cara Pike and Meredith Herr are with us, and their partner in this, Rise Consulting, is Sarika Tandon. So we have these, I believe, all three with us. And so I'll turn it over to the three of you to present yourselves and walk us through whatever presentation you want to share with the council this morning.
Thank you so much, David. And I also just want to take a brief moment to celebrate the gift of Kaya Morris's leadership in this work in Vermont. So thank you so much, Kaya, for what you shared. So hi, everyone. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Sarika Tandon. I'm the principal of Rise Consulting, where we shine light on structural racism and climate and the environment through race equity-centered strategy, consulting, training, coaching, and research. And I'm honored to be partnering with Cara Pike and Meredith Herr at Climate Access, a nonprofit organization building support for climate solutions through a learning center, piloting and innovative engagement projects, and providing strategic consulting services. So I just want to walk us through a little bit of the approach that we're taking to the public engagement process, after which Cara will walk us through the timeline and the different phases of the engagement. And at the end, Meredith will talk to us about some immediate next steps we'd like to take, and we would be happy to be in dialogue and deal with some questions with the council. So our approach centers co-creation, and what that really means is taking a collaborative approach to innovating design and implementation. So that means we'll be co-creating with the Climate Council via the partnership with CBI, with the subcommittees. And after starting to meet with you all, we realized that we wanted to create touch points with each of the subcommittees and not just be working directly with Just Transition. So we've built that into the process. And very importantly, also with the Vermont public. Next slide, please. So specifically in relation to communities, we want to create a process that invites community members in and supports their ability to contribute, assessing risks and opportunities, and determining strategies to prioritize. One of the many benefits of co-creation is that it builds buy-in not in an artificial way, but by authentically creating a plan that reflects the priorities of the community and involving the public in the process, so that what we come up with reflects the public. Also, it helps us to integrate multiple perspectives and levels of expertise, and we honor and center community expertise as well as some of the other kinds of technical expertise that we need in these kinds of plans. And building buy-in through community involvement in the development of a plan that reflects the priorities of multiple communities, not just the usual suspects. Another component of our approach is equitable engagement, and that means engaging communities with respect, accessibility, and reciprocity, engaging specifically with communities that face disproportionate climate impacts. This includes putting an emphasis on community expertise from BIPOC, low-income, youth, LGBTQIA, people with disabilities, and other communities that are often underrepresented in these types of processes. And just a practice example of a practice for that is offering underrepresented community members stipends for their time and participation, and being responsive to communities and giving adequate lead time. So I just want to say the conversation that I've had a chance to hear today really reflects this approach we would like to take. So I'm really happy to hear you all considering building more time into building a respectful reciprocal engagement process. So some of the practices that we'll be using are based on evidence-based approaches, including polling, factoring public opinion trends and social science, and connecting climate change to what is relevant in people's lives, which is often very different for different people. We'll be using multiple pathways for engagement, including storytelling, visual communications, community events and deliberative dialogues, and stakeholder surveys and interviews. And again, these methods support people in engaging and contributing to prioritization and decision-making for the climate plan. And I want to emphasize the importance of going at the right pace. So that means allowing time for outreach and input to avoid a process that only involves the usual suspects. I heard that language being used earlier. It does take time to build out those relationships and to build trust and get people engaged. We want to avoid harm to relationships with communities that have been historically underrepresented and are critical to engage. Again, a theme that's come up today. Providing adequate time for the community to input to inform the draft, and avoiding that checkbox community engagement. Like there's a difference between just telling people versus asking them and then incorporating their perspectives into the plan. So I want to turn things over to Kara Pike, who's going to walk us through the different phases of the engagement process.
Great, thank you so much, Sarika, and thank you everyone for having us. We're very excited to work on this project. I'm Kara Pike with Climate Access, and I'm a Canadian American, so I'm joining you from British Columbia on the traditional and unceded territories of the Cowichan people. And again, very excited to be working with you. So that co-creation process that Sarika mentioned is really at the heart of everything we're going to do. And what we want to avoid is coming up with policy recommendations and a plan and putting it out to the public for comment versus working with public stakeholders to come up with what those recommendations should be in the first place. When we move the public engagement to an early phase and that respectful co-creation approach, we're going to have a better understanding of what the risks are that we're facing from climate change, and we're going to have much better solutions coming. People are the experts in their communities. They're the experts in their lives and how these issues are going to impact them. So that's really critical throughout. So phase one is really very, very important because it's, and I was pleased to see this in the RFP, that you had a specific call out around really understanding audiences, because what we really need to do is get clear on who needs to be involved with this decision making and what are their thoughts on the issues, where are they at, where are they coming from at this. So we have a big piece at the front end to really take time on that. So working with the team here, Just Transition Subcommittee, we've added a piece that was not in the original proposal around working with also with each of the other subcommittees to make sure that the public engagement is integrated throughout. So to the points about wanting it not just to be housed in just transition, we've adjusted the plan around that. And then also gained an understanding that there's also a comprehensive energy plan being developed, and really wanting to make sure that we're integrating these things. One of the challenges, if all these different entities or subcommittees going out and doing engagement separately, is it can be very confusing for public stakeholders. What is this piece? I don't understand how it fits into the big picture. You've just come to me last month for X, you're coming back to me for this. I don't get that. And I think in particular, that can really be a burden on BIPOC communities around engagement if we're not organized and really respectful in how we're doing that. So you see some pieces there around roundtables. So moving into that deliberative dialogue effort right away at the outset. So moving to phase 2 then, the next slide. From that, really taking the time to listen, talk to people, hear from people on how do we even do the engagement. Then we create the engagement plan from that basis. That plan will really guide the rest of the efforts throughout the work. Designing a social media and amplification campaign as part of that, figuring out what the right outreach materials are, creating those, and then also what's needed for the website. And I really appreciated Kaya's comment about with the materials, this is about communicating the relevance, right? And we often don't take the time with climate communications to actually get into that discourse around what does this actually mean for our lives? How will this affect us? And what are the solutions that are really going to be impactful? So moving to phase 3, once we have the plan and the tools created, we'll be actively engaged in the outreach. We'll officially kick off the public engagement period. We'll announce that, we'll hold an event. And then to Sarika's point, we're going to have a lot of different ways that we're engaging, and that will be really distilled in the engagement plan. But some of the things that we've identified is having a very simple online survey, engaging in a whole online deliberation process, which goes beyond a survey, which really allows people to explore the issues and some of the policy options and solutions that you're considering and weigh in on that. Again, before the plan is drafted, we want to do this type of engagement. And then stakeholder dialogues. And these are deliberative dialogues where it's absolutely critical that the emphasis is on listening to different community stakeholders around how climate change impacts their lives, what they're most concerned about, the ideas they're most supportive of, and ideas that perhaps have not been considered by any of the committees that also need to be at the table. And that's what we find all the time in doing this work around the US and Canada, is that when you're really involving public stakeholders in co-creation, you get ideas that you would have never come up with yourselves. And often those are the ones that really have community needs and care and equity at the heart. Moving ahead to the next phase. What we want to do is make sure that we're co-creating this process throughout so that we're building excitement around the work and partnerships so that different leaders, influencers in the community, by the time we actually have a draft plan, are going to want to help us share that out and continue to engage the networks that they are connected with in this. So we'll have a promotion around the release of the plan. And that includes partner support. So back to that very first phase, when we're interviewing people, we're inviting people to the discussions, to the deliberative dialogues. We're going to go back to these same folks and say, are you willing to help us roll this out? And if so, what do you need in terms of support? And I think it's really critical what Sarika mentioned at the outset, that we have in our budget and in our plans compensation, so that we're respecting people for their time and their expertise. So that'll happen throughout the comment period. And then we get to the release of the final action plan with a number of activities there. And then we move into the fourth phase. And this is really where we're looking, actually, before we jump into that, we have time set aside to really continue to promote the plan once it's finished, because what we're aiming for is that Vermonters are partners in implementing the plan. The policies are critical, but they're not enough. We need people taking steps in their own lives to prepare for impacts and cut emissions to get to the goals. So we have time in our plan to continue to work with everyone really around now what are the steps people can take to help achieve the goals laid out in the plan. And then finally, we do have an evaluation period where we'll really look back at how did this all work? Did we hit our goals? Did we really manage to include people in the process who often are left out of these types of decision making? And so that'll be an important stage at the end. So that's basically an overview of the activities that we have planned. And again, really looking forward to working with everyone and welcome questions.
Thanks, Kara. Thanks, Sarika. That's really helpful. I wonder if we want to drop the slides just for a second, and we may be able to bring them back up if we need them. I noticed on those slides that probably the timing on the left-hand side may be adjusted depending on how this council decides, like whether we're doing draft plan on December 1st or not. So just an FYI, that those dates will reflect what this council decides eventually. Okay, so we have a little bit of time or questions, and then I think we should take a break and then come back and do some public comment around this. I'll just do a quick reflection. Sarika and Kara, is it fair to say that you could boil that down to what I would call 4 real phases or touch points with the public? One being the early engagement that happens right away, starting now-ish, right? That sort of initial, how do we talk about these issues with different publics? A second piece is around when we're starting to tease out potential draft strategies, things are coming out of the subcommittees, you want to have conversations, right? That's a more substantive set of conversations with publics, but that's a second touch point. The third is when you have a full draft action plan and you go out and you do public engagement around that. And then the fourth is the communication strategy around the final plan and how you want to send that off in a communications way. Is that a fair summary of how you all are seeing this work?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to clarify that the very first phase is regarding co-creation on how do we do the public engagement itself, right? So the conversations that we'll have, the interviews, those roundtables that will lead is, who do we need to reach? What is the best way to do that? What are the barriers? Where are the opportunities? And really having that inform the plan itself. But I'll turn it over to Sarika to see if you have anything else you want to add.
I agree. Yeah, I think that's I appreciate the way you distill that, David.
Great. Okay. And I see in the chat that Jane would love to have you speak to the time. And if we are now looking at as a likely scenario of a draft complete action plan on December 1st, does that give you the kind of time you think you would need to work through those 4 touch points of engagement?
It feels a lot better than when we heard the draft might be coming out in October. I just will say though, I do have a concern around the fact this plan is mitigation and adaptation, and both of these things need to come together by then. And particularly, the comment that was made earlier regarding the resilience subcommittee around when we do adaptation planning, like if it's just a project that's an adaptation plan, it is so critical to do the engagement properly, to really understand what the risks are for people, because there's no way to get to the level of detail that you need with technical approaches. So for example, we were working in a county in California. They had done LIDAR, they knew from a data standpoint all of the different risks. But that's not the same as talking to someone and like, what does this actually mean for your life if this were to flood here, or you were to have this kind of a storm event? So, I think it's very ambitious to do both. And I don't think that it's actually much different on the mitigation side, because you need to understand what are the issues getting in the way for people cutting carbon, right? Like what's actually getting in the way, and where are the equity issues in that, and how will the policy options impact people economically and in other ways. So it's ambitious. And I think part of it is we need to get a better understanding of how the whole planning process is going to come together with the council and across the subcommittees, because I think that'll at least give me a better sense of, okay, so here's what's happening with adaptation versus mitigation, and then we could do a better job of kind of figuring out that trajectory. But Sarika, anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to add that I'm experiencing a little bit of lack of clarity around the vulnerability assessment or risk assessment, and whether there's a social vulnerability overlay. And because I know that good engagement surfaces risks and vulnerabilities that sometimes our scientists don't. So I'm curious about that. And when talking about BIPOC communities, I built in a piece about asking them about perceived risks. Because I know that sometimes how communities self-define risk is very different than what we hear from the more technical side.
Okay, that's helpful.
Can I just note that we in the Rural Resilience Subcommittee, we have definitely talked about the necessity of what you just noted, Sarika, as part of the vulnerability assessment. How to do that, we haven't even begun to think about, but we have definitely recognized it's a necessity.
Great. So it's been 2 hours since we've been on this. That's a lot to ask of our collective concentration. Is there reactions or feedback we want to say right now before we take a break, while it's still fresh in your minds when you heard Sarika and Kara describe the way they're seeing the work? Lauren?
Yeah, thanks, David, and everyone else, especially from Just Transitions. I'll just say I'm really, really grateful to hear that the consultants have baked in some work across the subcommittees, that is a need that all of the subcommittees very much have in this moment. And that seems like all of us are talking about fairly regularly. So I'm very glad to hear that expertise and lived experience is going to be embedded across the subcommittees. And I'm also glad to hear, but seeking a bit of confirmation, Kara, I think you mentioned that we keep hearing the need to make sure that we're paying people to come to these tables. And I was going to ask, how are we going to do that? But it sounds like you said there is room in the budget for consulting to do that. And I just want to make sure that that's the case and that we don't need to be searching for more money as a group here.
Well, we have budgeted funds to pay people for engaging in our process. But it seems that with the subcommittees and the council, you may have another issue around that you need to address that's separate.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
And I just want to say one thing too around, like, when we talk about these things and we're talking about different communities, I think it's really important that we say those who are most impacted by climate change versus those most vulnerable. Because oftentimes those who are most impacted actually have tremendous strengths and assets that they're bringing to the challenge as well. And so that's just a little language piece. I just wanted to, I think it's good for the council to keep that in mind, that no one really likes to be labeled as a vulnerable person. And what we often see is that in communities where maybe there are economic vulnerabilities. People have experienced and continue to experience systemic racism and other injustices that they often, there's often incredible strengths such as social resilience, connectivity, all those types of things. So.
Yeah, I just want to embroider on that. Defining communities by their strengths and their assets versus using marginalized language that just reinforces some of those dynamics. Thanks for that, Kara.
Yeah, okay. Anything else before we take a break? Okay. So it's 10:41 now. I think honestly 10 minutes is too short. So why don't we come back at 10:55, 5 minutes before the hour. And when we come back, we will do some public comment around these issues. So thanks for everyone who's been joining us as well to observe our meeting today. And we'll create a window for public comment then and also at the very end of the meeting. So we'll see you back here at 10:55, 5 minutes before the hour, and we'll get right going again. Thanks everybody for some very powerful conversations this morning. Take a break, turn off your screen, do what you need to do. We'll see you back here at 5 of. Take care. If you are listening in today and you'd like to make a comment on these issues we've been talking about this morning, I'll ask that you raise your hand as we get going now. Okay. So folks, I'll have everybody circle back in. I invite you to turn on your cameras, come back in. We're going to take about 10 minutes and do some public comment, and I'll, depending on how many folks we have. I see one hand in the public comment. Welcome back, folks. So the person who's labeled is GMG. I'm going to put you up as a panelist. So if you want to, you can turn on your camera. Just hang on 1 second and I will do that. So the person who's labeled is GMG. I just brought you up as a panelist and I welcome you if you want to turn on your camera or just open up your mic and speak.
Good morning. My name is George Gross and I'm in Shoreham. I wanted to circle back to the climate action plan outline briefly. When I read through it, obviously it was very comprehensive across many, many topics. But one thing I thought that a plan would likely want to have, but I did not see, was some assignment of the organizational entity or entities that were actually responsible for executing the plan. There's very little of that type of anywhere, and it's mostly about the what and not the who of the process of executing this plan. And there might also need to be within that some concrete milestones or objectives for those entities that are responsible for a given work item, what they're supposed to deliver by a given date, maybe as incremental or interim goals. That's all my comment.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for sharing that. And indeed, I don't know, Jane, if in hearing that, I know that the idea on that plan was that, the draft outline is that for the actions that are for immediate implementation, that there is a section about who and what needs to happen. Is that correct, Jane?
Yes, thank you. I having gotten cut off, that's an important part of the upfront action for each section, but also there was a section at the end that speaks to implementation of the climate action plan. And I think many of George's comments would be relevant under that as well. And that would probably behoove me to put some more details in that section that spoke to some of the specifics that you just commented on, George. So thank you for that.
Great. Okay. Thanks, George. So if other folks have a comment, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I'm happy to bring you in. Excellent. I'm seeing a comment from Steve Crawley. Steve, he's going to take a second. He'll come up here as a panelist. Steve, go ahead and unmute yourself. And if you want to put on your camera, you're welcome to.
Hi. Thanks for giving me this opportunity, giving us this opportunity. I appreciate your conversation this morning a great deal. As someone who has worked on climate mitigation policies for many years, and also in the last few years, chairing a national task force for Sierra Club on climate adaptation, one thing that I want to suggest is, as you think about adjusting your timing and your deadlines and your public engagement and all, I think that the mitigation and adaptation can be handled somewhat differently that way. One way, they're both really important. The idea of full engagement of the community is absolutely essential. At the same time, the climate is warming and the planet is hurting and is in trouble. So the longer we wait on mitigation, the harder the task is on adaptation. So I would suggest thinking of those in two different ways regarding extending your plan deadline. You might have some aspects of a plan that are less drafty in December and some aspects that are more drafty. And I think that's okay, and it's inevitable. So that's my suggestion, is that you keep in mind that those greenhouse gas reduction goals are there for a reason. And now we have a new national goal that is even tougher by 2030. So if we postpone that side of the equation, we're really asking for more trouble down the road. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks so much. Okay, are there others who are listening in today who would like to make a comment on the issues we've been talking about this morning? And we will do some more public comment at the end if folks would like to speak then instead. Okay, I'm not seeing additional hands, so why don't we keep moving forward? Thanks to both of you that spoke just now. Okay, so we have three more things we wanted to do. Some of them are quite short and some of them might need a little more conversation. The first thing we wanted to do is to get an update from Secretary Moore on the testimony that was given in front of the legislature now a little over a week ago, and anything that it's important for all of us in the council to hear, all of you on the council to hear from the conversation with the legislature. So I'll turn it over to Secretary Moore to give us an update on how those conversations went and the things that are particularly important for all of us to know about. Secretary Moore, I don't hear you that well for some reason. You're coming in and out a little bit.
I've been having
Oof.
Is this any
really
better?
That's good right there, whatever
Okay.
you just did. Yeah.
I switched its auto detection function to tell it what microphone it should be listening to.
Well done.
The better part of 2 weeks ago now, Chris Campany and Liz Miller and Jane and I participated in a hearing of the House Energy and Technology Committee. And we took the approach that had been discussed in the steering committee, which was to have a representative of the administration accompanied by the members of the steering, one or both of the members of the steering committee from the legislative body making the appointments to join us in the testimony. We provided a fairly robust overview of the work of the council to date. I had last been in front of that committee towards the end of January, so prior to establishing subcommittees, and we're able to update them on the work done to stand up the subcommittees and then the tasks that the subcommittees have identified for themselves, as well as the overall timeline related to our work. It was a very robust conversation and one that I think probably merits repeating. on a fairly standardized set of timeline to keep them informed of the work. And I think having multiple people there able to help answer committee questions and provide insight and feedback was very valuable. That testimony is available on the legislature's website. And once I'm done talking here, we can post a link to it in the chat to the extent anyone would like to have a look. That has been the only specific request for legislative testimony we've received to date regarding the work of the Climate Council. There have been other requests around the governor's recommendation for a climate action package as part of the federal recovery funds, and can speak to those in a bit more detail, but would welcome Chris, and I don't know if Liz is on the line. I haven't seen her face this morning, but if Chris wanted to weigh in and add anything in regarding the testimony in front of House Energy and Technology.
No, I think that was a good summary. And yeah, we did stress, again, just needing the time to get this right. And I think, Julie, I think it's fair to say that they were receptive to that. I mean, I don't think that they had any sense that we're just kind of sitting back and letting things roll, or that there were any politics at play or anything like that. That we're just we're building a solid foundation from which to do the work, and that's taking some time to build that foundation.
Yes, no, I agree that I think that they were pleased, maybe is the right word, with the progress we were able to share. Had questions about next steps, including bringing on consultants, and have shared with the committee assistant the RFP for technical services, which hadn't been released publicly when we were in front of the committee, so that they will know that the work continues. And I think are very much struggling in the same place we are, with the urgency around climate action and the strong desire to make sure that we're doing this job as well as we can do it, and how to balance those two pieces in arriving at an overall timeline and set of work products. So I think it was it was a good and robust conversation, and much appreciated.
Great. Okay. Council members, any questions for Secretary Moore, for Chris, about what happened with the legislature? Any questions or comments? All good? Okay, great. So why don't we pivot then right into the next piece, which is about the Vermont's proposal of how to use funding from the American Recovery Plan Act. And again, Secretary Moore, you're going to kick us off on that. And then I believe other folks here who are heads of agency can supplement, but I'll leave it in your hands, Julie, about how you want to handle that.
Sure. I thought maybe I'd share my screen. I have just a couple slides, and
Great.
I assume I have the ability to do that.
Cameron
Find out in
says
a moment.
yes.
Can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen?
You're
All
looking
right.
good.
Fantastic. So just at the highest level, as you may be aware, there's about $2.7 billion worth of federal stimulus funding coming to Vermont under the auspices of the Federal Recovery Plan. About $1 billion of that is fairly flexible. The other $1.7 billion comes with a set of prescribed uses related to education, rental payment relief, a number of functions within the Agency of Human Services. But there is about $1 billion of relatively discretionary money. And the governor has put together a package around those pieces. And I thought this morning would take a few minutes just to specifically talk about the climate change bucket within this $1 billion of funding. So the governor has indicated $200 million, or has asked the legislature to appropriate $200 million for climate action. And part of it is our activities around any of these dollars have to tie back to negative economic impacts associated with COVID-19. But there's also an opportunity to be forward-looking and thinking about public health and the environment. And so this is sort of the purpose statement we've put together around the use of these funds. And I would say that the funding would sort of be best looked at in two broad categories. Those first four I would describe as no regrets policies. And then $100 million proposed to be held in reserve to support the initial implementation of the climate action plan. Just talking briefly about each of those no regrets investments. The first is continuing the work needed to build out our electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Vermont has about 300 public charging stations at this point, and it's believed this work would add more than 100 to those ranks, including a mix of level 2 and level 3 charging stations spread throughout the state, both along at strategic locations along the state highway system, as well as seeking out businesses and multifamily housing areas to install these charging stations. And we know having a robust build out of our electric vehicle infrastructure is critical to supporting the adoption of electric vehicles. The next tranche of funding is proposed for the weatherization program. As folks may be aware, in his FY22 budget, the governor proposed funding to go both into the Office of Economic Opportunity at AHS with Sarah Phillips' team, as well as VHFA to accelerate the pace of some of the weatherization work. And this would allow for that continued acceleration through the end of fiscal year 24. So essentially stretching out the time where we would continue to have ramped up work in the space. The next category we've broadly titled electrification incentives, but it includes things like load management, beneficial electrification, and other strategies that will help us take full advantage of renewable generation sources that have been already brought online, but at times are limited by constraints within the grid. And I'm sure Commissioner Tierney could speak more to this if there are questions. And then finally is $25 million to do some of the, or implement some of the highest priority actions from the state's 2018 hazard mitigation plan. The hazard mitigation plan is obviously Director Borneman's bread and butter and something that came out of her shop, but one of the highest priority recommendations was looking at creating a state level program for buyouts of parcels that have been impacted by flooding and flood hazards that are ineligible for FEMA related funding, making it challenging oftentimes for those homeowners and business owners to be able to weather the economic storm that would come with relocating to higher and safer space because there aren't dollars available to assist in making that transition. And that's what this money would largely be dedicated to. So about $100 million of no regrets policies spread out over the next 3 years, and then $100 million held in reserve to support initial recommendations out of the climate action plan. Just so folks are aware, work is continuing on the budget, quick work, and it's in Senate appropriations right now. We haven't seen, to the best of my knowledge, although Secretary Young may have more current information, exactly how these climate change investments may or may not be reflected in the legislature's budget. But we are hopeful and certainly welcome your input and feedback here and now.
Great. And Secretary Moore, would you like others to speak to any of those, or we just want to go for questions?
I think if we go for questions, and to the extent they relate to an area of expertise that may best lie with Secretary Young or Commissioner Tierney, that would be great too.
Okay.
Or Director Borneman, I should add.
Perfect. Secretary Young.
Just to follow up on the question about budget, Senate Appropriations Committee is reportedly meeting today to finalize both the general fund budget, which is a feat unto itself every year, but also their intention is to include a American Rescue Plan component of that budget, which is going to be transparent and show all of the appropriations that they are recommending in one place in the broader budget. And then secondly, I think if folks are interested in this, we could post perhaps in the chat or on the website the full proposal, which really will give folks, if they choose to take one, a deeper dive into each of the components of the plan. And so I think we could maybe have Jane do that at some point, but it's all there, and I'll stop and let you ask questions.
Great. Okay. Chris has a specific question on the buyouts. It's in the chat. about, is there a focus on that? I wonder if someone wants to speak to the focus of that buyout program or what's envisioned there.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So just to build on what Secretary Moore said, the program would be primarily a buyout program for areas of the state that are outside of the special flood hazard area, but are still within the flood corridor and therefore still experience repetitive damage from especially flooding. Flooding disasters. And the intent there is to build into the program a way to focus on areas that have especially economic inequalities, and therefore folks are less able to lift themselves up out of a situation where they're experiencing repetitive loss, and it's just a cycle of a self-defeating cycle of damage upon damage. And so part of that is looking at mobile home parks around the state, but as well as targeting areas where folks are the most impacted by flooding hazards.
Great, that's helpful. Okay, great. And I'm seeing a question from Sue in the chat as well about this distinction between the overall proposal for multi-year appropriations and the legislature's ability to pass 1 year, sort of 1 year approach. I think it also speaks sort of like that final bucket, which is for the climate action plan. Like if there's any more detail that maybe Secretary Moore, you can speak to that.
Yeah, I can start and then would be glad for Suzanne to weigh in and add to her correct. So, right, this is $1 billion we are given through the end of calendar year 24. So December 31st of 2024 to spend the money. One of the many challenges we're dealing with right now is we don't have the official federal guidance that will be issued by the U.S. Treasury Department to tell us exactly what it means to spend the money even. Does that mean it just needs to be in a budget, in a contract, and sort of on track to build something, or does the work actually have to be complete? As you may recall, with the CARES Act money that came into Vermont early on in the pandemic, that money actually had to all have been expended by the end of last calendar year. So we're waiting for that important clarification. My understanding is that in part because of the timing of the work on the budget and not having the final Treasury guidance, the legislature intends to reserve a considerable amount of the money and really just deal with the FY22 appropriations as part of this year's budget. There may be places where they put some of that funding into reserve for specific purposes. But I don't believe that there is any intention to allocate that full $1 billion this year. The other moving piece that's out there, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is talk at the federal level about a larger infrastructure package that could include components related to both water and sewer and climate and potentially broadband, which are all part of the governor's proposal. And so there's a bit of trying to make sure that we use the best tool for each of these jobs and anticipating that the infrastructure dollars may be somewhat more constrained than the ARPA dollars. And so trying to make sure that we're making best decisions based on the available uses of those money, which we don't understand yet fully. I don't know, Suzanne, if there's anything you'd add to that description.
No, Julie, there's nothing I would add. I think you've nailed it. It is certainly a work in progress. And it's going to extend over 4 years at a minimum, with probably additional money for maybe overlapping purposes. So our job is going to be to leverage every dollar. And we did it with the coronavirus relief money that you mentioned, and where we thought we had a need and we couldn't use all the money for that need, we took the money back, reverted it into other needs. And it's just an interesting exercise in flexibility. So stay tuned for the guidance. That's going to be the next critical step. Some could come out as early as today, but the The statutory deadline in the federal law for guidance is 60 days, which is May 11.
Great. Okay. I see hands from Chris and then Abby. Chris, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So Erica, just to follow up quickly. So to the second point of my question in the chat, are you guys thinking about, like I'm assuming that in a number of these cases, the buyouts may actually be buyouts of actual neighborhoods, which is what like the manufactured home park would be, or areas at risk, saying, I'm thinking Brattleboro or other communities in our region where, it's neighbors who often know each other. It's a community. Is the intent to take kind of more of a community, and I don't mean to get to the weeds, but this is important from a just transitions perspective, is the idea to address the buyouts as a community effort, as far as like relocating people out of harm's way and doing it by engaging with them as a community. And I bring that up because I know, again, having lived in Louisiana, and oftentimes here I'll hear people talk about, why on earth would people stay in the lower Ninth Ward when they're constantly flooded? Well, the reason is that's where they live. It's their community. It's people they know. It's people they love. It's their culture. It's their institutions. And I'm just hopeful that Vermont, to the extent that we're not just looking at individual buyouts, but like actual, more of a planned buyout, that we're taking a kind of community focused approach to this. Would that be the case?
To be honest, we haven't gone to that level of detail yet, Chris. So we are open and have not even begun an engagement process on, how this should be formulated. Mostly because we really need to see where the legislature wants to go with it. But, certainly my intent is to have an engagement process as it relates to how we develop the program. So I'll take that piece of feedback and anticipate having further conversations about how to operationalize that.
Great. Abby?
Yeah, just wanting to build a little bit further on Chris's point. I mean, to the entire point of today's presentation, it seems to me like this is a really wonderful opportunity to do some of that on the ground engagement to best see, there are some assumptions going into the structuring of where this money is going, and not to fully question that, but just to sort of ground truth that within Vermont's disparate communities and geographical regions as to how this is landing for them, and if they're feeling involved in the process and as though this is the best way for that money to be utilized. It does seem like this might be a good opportunity for some of that work to be done as well.
Yeah, and Abby, I don't know if your comment is based on like the package as a whole or just the buyout piece, but I'll just speak a little bit more about the buyout piece. This is really one of the reasons why this is one of the highest priorities in the hazard mitigation plan, is because the federal program has some pretty high barriers to entry. Meaning like the town or city has to support the applicant and has to apply on behalf of the applicant. And so some of them don't want to do that. There's a match requirement, 25% match requirement for the federal program, which can be a significant barrier to entry, especially if you're already upside down on your mortgage. So there's a lot of things that point to why we need to develop a state level program, and we want to be sure that it's also a lot of money. I mean, this is an ambitious project, so we need to frame the program in a way that it can be taken advantage of fully. And so if we need to do the on the ground work and engagement work on the front end, then that's something we're open to for sure.
Yeah, and I guess I was talking about the whole thing. I think this is an opportunity for us to begin this process, maybe start a new pathway as to how we engage with communities. To Rise's point, the co-creation of how this is leveraged for the benefit of all of Vermont's people's. I'm not trying to be difficult or political or anything, or to question the governor and the administration's judgment, just that it seems like in terms of, we are, as I see it, attempting to take on some really transformative work. And, I'm married to a builder, so the foundation of the house wasn't built correctly. The house isn't going to last. And so how do we take this opportunity within this moment to sort of ground truth how we're moving forward and how communities are engaging with the ways that this money is being spent? Because I have heard anecdotally a lot of feelings like there's all this money floating around out there. There's, I'm hearing about all these things, but my personal impact in my personal life, I am not feeling any of this. And that to me seems as though there is a disconnect happening somewhere. And I would like us to ensure that, to the best of our abilities, obviously these systems are imperfect, that we can mitigate some of those disconnects as we move forward. Thanks.
And I think that's very much reflected in the idea of holding half the funding available for direction through the climate action plan. I mean, there's a lot of challenges here with timing and timeline, and the fact that this is an incredible amount of resources that has a fairly finite lifespan to it. And so trying to balance all those pieces, but part and parcel of that $100 million reserve, proposed reserve to support implementation of the climate action plan is exactly that, Abby, to give time, and also to be able to reflect all of the important work that this group is doing in establishing priorities for that investment.
Kaya?
Thank you for letting me provide some input on this. So one of the things that I think is really powerful and promising when we're thinking about community engagement, we tend to see it as a, it's very transactional, but it's often as well just sort of inputs or outputs rather than it being an iterative process. One of the proposals that we're most excited about around Renew, which is something that I've seen some other bills that have come up. I think Brian Chena had one around regenerative economy, is looking at a participatory budgeting process. So if we're talking about going into a community to try that we've seen has been, it's been identified through our mapping tools, has been identified through our community outreach and through the qualitative and quantitative data that's really highlighting these are areas of distinct need, to be able to let those communities be the ones to determine. Because part of the problem as well is that we've had climate plans that had to go through our RPCs, and the communities really didn't get engagement. Like that wasn't a real thing. And so that's why instead there's a reactionary component to it. People be like, I don't understand why you're trying to put up all these, we're getting windmills, what are we getting, solar panels on this whole side of a mountain, like where people have had very distinct sort of visceral responses to not being asked, what would you actually like to see? And can you help us design it? So it's not just tell us your wish list and we're going to go because we know what's best to figure out how to make that work, but it's actually, you are actually doing the work. Like you as the individual are actually doing the work. And that's a very, very different approach. And we've seen that happening. It's come out of Providence, Rhode Island, and it's picked up all across the country, either called green justice zones or climate zones. So think about that as a way to also activate that buy-in, activate that community engagement, and to make sure that this work sticks in a meaningful way. And it's not just something done to folks, but it's done something with folks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Kaya. Yeah. Secretary Young?
Thank you all, and to the last couple of points that were made, I we will get you out the full plan. But I think an important thing to remember with this, number one, no particular projects have been selected yet, but we learned an awful lot over the last 3 years by traveling as a cabinet to every county in the state at least twice. And we were, finishing up our second round and getting ready for our third before the pandemic. And a lot of these projects have already been planned within the communities in which, the extent of community involvement and input, I guess, remains to be seen. But these things have been planned, over years, decades. Some of them are shovel ready. A lot of them have to do with housing. A lot of them have to do with just the basic water infrastructure and stormwater and wastewater infrastructure within their towns and villages. And they are based on the visions of these smaller rural communities, and that they've just never had the momentum and the funding to move forward. So we're really very excited about the fact that this is very local focused, and that there's been a lot of local input to date on many of the items that we think will see the finish line with this money. So I just wanted to kind of frame that globally, that we're just not coming in and saying, you got to do this. We're going into communities that have done the work and trying to help them finish the work.
Great. Okay. All right. So clearly, for the half of this money that's being set aside for the climate action plan, this is where you as a council and everything we've been talking about this morning comes directly into play. And the other piece of that other half that Secretary Moore described, what I'm hearing is encouragement to put some participatory pieces into that as well. Okay.
David, I just want to be clear that this is all the governors recommend. It's currently sitting with the legislature, and they may choose to take him up on his recommendations or go a different direction. But that is very, as you've described, that is the feedback I've taken from the conversation this morning, and very much the direction we would plan to head, assuming this becomes the path forward.
Great. Okay. Great. Any last thoughts or comments on this, folks who haven't spoken up, but it's something in your head you want to say? Okay, great. So the last thing we wanted to do today, substantively, before we do another round of public comment, is to talk about the council's role going forward in the next couple of months, given this phase we're entering into, where a lot of work's going to happen in the subcommittees. And here, there's been some talk. Jane's been thinking about this a lot. She and I have been going back and forth on this. The steering committee's been talking about this. And we wanted to share a sort of vision of how we think the different puzzle pieces fit together in the coming months, particularly in what's left of this month, April, in May and June and into July. So we have a kind of vision about how the pieces fit together: the Climate Council, the steering committee and the co-chairs of the subcommittees. And we wanted to share that. And I wonder, Jane, do you want to walk folks through it, or would you like me to walk folks through it? What's your preference?
Happy either way. If you want to share that image, and I'm happy to do it, to kick it off.
Sure. So here's an image that helps to sort of get out our thinking of this. And it's a little bit busy, so you have to take a second to digest. And what this image is trying to do is to say, we think there's three venues of conversations that'll be happening in addition to the subcommittees themselves. And that's the Climate Council, these kinds of meetings like what we're having right now. The steering committee will be inviting subcommittee co-chairs to some coordination meetings. And then the steering committee has its own meetings as well. And these all have important purposes. And at the end of the day is looking for the right kind of touch points to help the subcommittees go forth and do the work that needs to get done in the coming months. Jane, do you want to say a little bit more about the intent and the purpose behind all this?
Sure. At this point in time, there was a recognition that most of the substantive work was happening at the subcommittee level. But as we've heard, not only with Just Transitions subcommittee working outward to engage with the other subcommittees, there's a lot of cross-pollination sort of needed in order to ensure that we're all getting it right with respect to outreach, engagement, strategies, development, and recommendations. And so the gist of this was for us to start thinking about how to have a strategic touch point for co-chairs for the subcommittees to be getting together and considering where they are with respect to overlap and difficulties, and to lean on each other to think about that. When we first started to think about that, we started to think really about the role of the Climate Council itself. And I'll put this out there for some discussion to see if there's a different approach out there, where we started to think about maybe the best way to address this was to think about shorter and more frequent council meetings, having the council meet as a suggested approach biweekly for a shorter period of time in order to hear those issues and concerns and address them in real time to keep the work moving forward. While that seemed like one realistic opportunity, we also thought about sort of the reality of getting together and just hearing administrative updates frequently, and how that might not lend itself with a large group to productive conversation. And so we thought about a smaller group coming together, which was already in place with the steering committee, to really have sort of substantive conversation, again, to keep the work moving consistently and quickly on the timeline that we're on, regardless of how slow we go with respect to engagement, knowing that there's going to be these issues that we want to work through as fast as possible. We also had almost forgotten in our haste that this was the process that we actually outlined in the process roadmap that you all have heard embedded and approved, that the steering committee would serve to be that convener for the co-chairs. So there are standing meetings of the steering committee. They meet bi-weekly, and the purpose has been to vet these challenging issues, but also to develop the Climate Council agendas. And so we're sort of seeing the bi-weekly meeting being to convene the co-chairs, and then the other meetings to be preparing for the Climate Council monthly meetings. I will suggest that one thing I want to point out is the timing of these meetings. They've been set on everybody's calendar, but I'm not sure if strategically they're set up the best right now, because what this lends itself is not having to reschedule those meetings with the steering committee folks, but it means that on the same week that we have the council meetings, that same Thursday will be the meeting where we bring in the co-chairs. And so it makes it a heavy week for co-chairs as well as council members who sit on both the council and the steering committee, obviously. So one idea, David's laid out the schedule here that suggests how we're meeting right now, and if we kept that schedule. But one suggestion that we might consider either today or at the steering committee this week is to rejigger the dates of those meetings to better meet both the council meeting agendas as well as the co-chair meetings. So the co-chairs have been invited for this coming Thursday in anticipation of you supporting this, but I just wanted to get it on their calendars. We can always back off if that's not the approach we take, but knowing that everybody's busy, I put it out there. And then going forward after this week, we would also look to extend those steering committee meetings from an hour to an hour and a half to ensure ample time for conversation to unfold with the co-chairs. So that's what's in front of us. I think that this proposal has felt like it resonates best with me and others, the steering committee and David, about what's best use of time with the steering committee. But the other proposal would be to engage more of you and have the council meet on a more often basis.
Thanks, Jane. That's helpful. Okay, so this is what's being proposed. It kind of takes your breath away a little bit in terms of the amount of meetings, not to mention all the subcommittee work that's going on. So that's a reality. We do feel that there's like this really critical foundational moment right now where everybody's getting going and needs to get going in a solid way. In our conversations this morning around equity and justice and just transition point to that as well. Secretary Young.
I just think it might be helpful to add to this conversation, if you could, Jane, that some of the feedback from the legislature involved a desire to have more frequent updates from subcommittees and their work. Have I got that right?
Great. That's a great point, Secretary Young. Would you like me to speak to that, how we see that working, or would you like to continue?
Yes, I think so, because we're trying to really be responsive to that without, requiring everybody to do a separate report or have a separate feedback chain just for the legislature. So there's some reasoning behind some of this. That'd be great.
Thank you. So yes, that came up in the testimony that Secretary Moore spoke to earlier with Liz Miller and Chris Campany and I. And in that, after the follow-up with the steering committee, Liz Miller suggested, and we heard from the committee that the legislature would like to hear more thorough updates about the work happening within the subcommittee. And one way we thought about doing that was having a concise strategic meeting once a month where subcommittees were reporting out, and then being able to provide that meeting link with some key summary points in real time to legislative members that would be one way to keep them informed on a monthly basis of the work that's happening consistently across all 5 subcommittees.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'm watching also in the chat concerns that the meeting times means that folks aren't all available, and particularly if they're done with not a lot of time ahead, and suggestions that we use tools like a doodle poll or when is good to schedule those out. So we could try that, Jane, as well. If we think we can get better attendance in those meetings, we could try to do that and push it out a little bit in the future.
Yeah, yes, and I tried to highlight that for this week in particular, that this was by far short notice. We didn't expect or understand that everybody could be there. I will suggest that scheduling the steering committee meetings was very challenging with schedules. And so opening that back up to reschedule the steering committee meetings, it's totally something to consider now that we're asking a larger group to be involved, but also mindful of how hard that was to have a standing meeting.
Yeah, that's right. And the one other thing we'll put out there is that one of the benefits of having co-chairs in the steering committees is that it's okay if one co-chair makes it to these meetings, and you all can share the burden that way. And it's also gives us the flexibility of like so many people's schedules. And so our expectation would be as long as one co-chair is available, that we would probably consider that a win. Open to thoughts on that. Abby?
I am not saying this to imply that I disagree entirely, but I would like to point out that, again, to the point of today's discussion, Leslie Ann is the only Black woman on this council, and I am a working person. And my point of views cannot be fully represented by my co-chair. No offense, Billy, but he and I have had this talk, so we're good, I think. And I'm concerned by that. So I will just put that out there.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Catherine?
I would like to fully echo what Abby just said, and to note one of the reasons why we have co-chairs is not only to share the work, but to share the perspective. And it doesn't feel very good as a co-chair to simply have someone say, it's okay if you can't make it, and we're going to go ahead without you. So I'll just put that out there, that did not land very well for me when I heard it. So I recognize the challenge of scheduling, but if we consider these to be important for the functioning and the cohesion of the committee work, I think it's really important that we be more intentional about scheduling times that the co-chairs can attend.
Great. Okay. So we're hearing a very clear message that getting everybody there is very important. So then it comes back on us to find pathways to make that happen. So we can absolutely take that back as a mandate. And then we'll work with you to figure out a way to make that happen. It's going to be a challenge, and we will use technology to our advantage and scheduling tools and the like. So maybe some of that is some individual check-ins as well to figure out if those are standing conflicts that you all have, or those are specific to this week or certain weeks. Okay. Catherine, did you want to jump back in, or okay, great. Okay.
Can I raise one point, David?
Yeah.
I think I don't want this to go unnoticed. Gina, who's on the subcommittee for cross-sector, raised a great point. When using the chat, you should not be sending the chat to only panelists. It should go to panelists and all attendees. Otherwise, the public can't see it. And that's my assumption, is we want the public to see it. So please make sure that you do that when you're chatting. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. So I guess what we're hearing is overall, this seems, unless folks want to raise up concerns, the idea of the structure makes sense. Our big piece of feedback right now is let's get the scheduling right so people can actually participate. Yeah. Joey?
Well, I think getting the scheduling right, I totally concur, is really crucial. The structure for me is still an open question though, in terms of, I get like wanting to make efficient use of people's time, but considering, you know, the work we need to do and the complexity in today's conversation, it does strike me that like as much participation of full council members in this process seems helpful. And so I know, I mean, you had noted there was the every other week full council meetings. I don't know if you surveyed folks in that and it didn't work to do like shorter council meetings, but more iterative. But I guess I would just say that from my perspective, it seems important to the degree people are able, and I know it's a major ask, but it seems important to have that sort of participation, or at least be open to it.
If I understand, you're suggesting, hey, hang on a second, let's see if it's possible to actually do every other week for the full council.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you surveyed folks and asked about whether or not, like, I mean, and I get you're trying to be efficient, but it strikes me that if we're lifting all of this up together, like I have a lot of faith in our co-chairs and the steering committee, but I do think this is a learning process and a participatory process for all of us. So it's an open question to me whether or not, you know, the structure, if we should go back to the original concept of shorter meetings every other week. And maybe that's a scheduling opportunity if people have Mondays and more flexibility. We've sort of embedded this already. It's an open question.
Yep. Yep. Jane, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring back to the council right now, to just ensure that we support which one we support. I will just also comment that the idea was that if we went with the steering committee, that would be a standing meeting where we would encourage and engage with the full council to participate as you can. And that way it wouldn't be just restricted to the steering committee, that as they always are, they would be open to other council members and the public to participate and engage in as well. So I think either way, we hope and encourage that as many councilors who want to attend those meetings and participate fully, that you will. So I think that regardless of what we choose, I hope that broader engagement is brought in by the council.
Yeah. How do folks feel about this? Does it make sense to kind of push that work more towards the steering committee with subcommittee chairs, again, with an open invitation as always for councilors to be there? Or does it make sense to think along the lines of what we're saying here? Well, maybe the full council should be meeting every 2 weeks and having these more frequent check-ins. Do folks have a thought about that, an opinion? This is where a little polling tool would be very helpful. Secretary Young?
Yeah, I think what you just said, I think we need a little more polling and work around this, and maybe definition of what we're trying to achieve. And we're trying to be mindful of everybody's time that they're spending in subcommittees doing the hard and substantive work, versus, taking up that time with 4-hour full council meetings on Mondays, and then the timing of the meetings and everybody's schedules. So I'm open to, if folks think a poll or survey or just feedback around this particular schedule, or if you have a better idea, let's talk about it at the next steering committee meeting if we get the ideas back by then. But I do think we need to get this right. Everybody needs to feel like they've been heard, and everybody has to feel like they have time to do the work that they've been asked to do.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing we could do just quickly to activate our, collective wisdom on this, if folks want to throw in the chat just real quick what your instinct is, in terms of let's go for bi-weekly council meetings, or let's go for something along the lines with that slide we just put up. I'd be interested if folks just threw it in the chat real quick, like what's your gut on this in terms of the smart move for us as we're trying to navigate this? I'd just go ahead and think about it for a second and throw in the chat and see what our collective wisdom points to. So my specific question is, do you think it's smart for us to do maybe bi-weekly, like every other week, the council, we all meet versus we do our monthly meetings and we have the steering committee with subcommittee chairs doing check-ins to do the coordination? Yeah, let's just let it run for a second and see what the other thoughts. Okay, so you can see, even with a few folks, thanks for folks for dropping stuff in the chat, you can see we actually have different views on this, which, you know, is kind of reality on a lot of things in life. So why don't we take this feedback back? The steering committee is going to meet on Thursday regardless, and we can try to figure out if there's an elegant solution to this. My guess is the solution probably goes along the lines of whichever way we do it, we encourage council members to be involved in the steering committee meetings, and we encourage folks to participate whichever way we go. Are there other last thoughts we have? And I really appreciate people throwing that in the chat. That's really helpful to have that. Any other last thoughts on this? Okay. All right. Sorry, we can't, it doesn't seem like we're able to right now make some definitive answer on this. So we will get back to you soonish about this and make sure folks have some visibility in their calendars about how this is all going to shake out. And we take very much to heart the strong reaction you had about the importance of having all the co-chairs involved in the conversations. So that came across loud and clear. So thank you for that feedback. Jane, any last words on this?
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious to hear then about this Thursday's meeting. And I'd be curious to see then if our preference for this week is to stick with just the steering committee. I just want to be clear on that. So the co-chairs are not necessary for this Thursday.
Yeah, I think what we've heard is it's important for the full group of co-chairs to be involved if we're going to go have that conversation. So why don't we stick with this normal steering committee meeting? Again, all of you are welcome to that as our co-chairs. However, the intent for this week's meeting will be a more traditional steering committee meeting, looking at the strategic questions we need to address, including this very question. Does that make sense? So we can back out of your calendars, co-chairs, for this Thursday, and we'll find a time that works for everybody. Okay, great. Okay, so that's the end of our work today, with the exception of opening up again the possibility of public comment for folks to weigh in on these issues we've been wrestling with this morning. So for those of you who are listening in to our conversation today, if you'd like to make further comment than what's been already done in this meeting, now's a good time to raise your hand, and I can go ahead and promote you up into our main room here. So I'll just wait a moment for folks to find that hand raise function. And I think if you can't, you can always text Cameron and he can help you sort things out. So members of the public, this is an opportunity if you'd like to make some comments. Now's a great opportunity.
Don't you normally promote everyone in at the end, David? Just that way it's more open, or no?
It doesn't quite work that way in Zoom.
Okay.
It's easier to just do it individually. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not seeing hands right now. I know you can also, the chat is available for everyone, attendees and panelists to use. So feel free if you want to drop a comment in the chat. Now is a good time to do that. Okay. I'm not seeing hands, so thanks everyone for joining us today. In terms of next steps, we've got some things on our plan. I say we, Jane and I, have some pieces from what we've talked about from this morning. I wonder, Secretary Young, if there's other things that you're seeing as next steps that we need to make sure are clear right now from our conversations.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think what I've seen and heard, the next step for the steering committee is to try to find, as you put it, an elegant solution to how we're going to structure our meetings, if we do, with subcommittees providing us with updates about their work, trying to free up time for those subcommittees to focus on the work as opposed to more meetings. Secondly, I think we're going to wait for the Just Transitions committees to finish up their work around their principles. And once that work is done, to discuss ways to incorporate those principles in everybody else's work, and also to incorporate individuals and members on that subcommittee into the work of other subcommittees. And then finally, I think those were the two big items that I've taken away. And if I've missed anything, certainly we can fill them in.
Yeah. And I would absolutely, I would add to the piece around just transitions, getting together principles and making sure that that gets embedded early on. The importance of what we talked about earlier, and how we're doing that work ourselves and how we're thinking about equity in how we are functioning. And there's some specific requests coming into the steering committee about thinking about what to do there, and training requests and other things for our own internal functioning. And those are pieces that we need to pick up and figure out a pathway on. Okay. Great. Anything else before we finish up today? Anything else? Okay, great. Am I forgetting something, Jane? No? Okay. Excellent. All right, folks. Well, thank you for hanging in there for 3.5 hours this morning. And, you know, we really made some important progress this morning, I think, in understanding what we're all up to. So I really appreciated everybody's willingness to go there this morning. Take care. We will see you in the subcommittee work. We'll see you in the steering committee conversations. Expect some greater clarity shortly from us about what this all means in terms of our meeting schedules. So feel free to unmute and say thanks and goodbye, and we'll see everybody in the coming days.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take
Have a good
care.
week.